My daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye during Thanksgiving dinner and said, "Do not bother coming to Christmas because you are just a troublesome old black man who embarrasses my family." I spent Christmas in absolute silence. But at midnight on Christmas Eve, my son called me in a blind panic, screaming, "Dad, you are on Fox News. What did you do?" They all stared in shock. My name is Harrison Hayes. I am 69 years old, and my family made the ultimate mistake of judging a book by its worn-out cover. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach ungrateful family members a permanent lesson. The heavy porcelain turkey platter slammed against the dining table with a violent crack. Hot brown gravy sloshed over the rim and splattered directly onto my faded flannel shirt. I did not flinch. I slowly looked up from my plate and met the furious blue eyes of my daughter-in-law, Courtney. She stood at the head of the table with her perfectly manicured hands resting on her hips, breathing heavily. Her blonde hair was styled to perfection for the upper-crust guests she planned to host later that evening. She raised her index finger and pointed it directly at my face. "You are ruining my holiday, Harrison," she snapped. Her voice was sharp and laced with pure venom. "I am tired of pretending everything is fine. You sit there in your cheap clothes acting like you belong in this neighborhood. Do not bother coming to our Christmas dinner next month. You are just a troublesome old black man who clings to his son. My parents are bringing their country club friends for Christmas, and I will not have you sitting in my living room looking like a homeless contractor. You embarrass my family." The silence in the room became an absolute vacuum. I felt the hot gravy soaking through the thin fabric of my shirt against my chest. Courtney stood tall, radiating arrogance and entitlement. She firmly believed that her middle-class upbringing somehow elevated her above the man sitting at her table. She looked at me with pure disgust, as if my presence alone contaminated the expensive air of the suburban mansion she lived in. I did not answer her immediately. Instead, I shifted my gaze to my son Terrence, who sat perfectly still at the opposite end of the table. The boy I had raised from a fragile child into a grown man was staring intensely at his half-empty wine glass. He refused to look at me. He refused to defend the father who had given up everything to secure his future. The silence stretched on, and the weight of his cowardice crushed the remaining air from my lungs. My mind flashed back through the decades of brutal labor I endured to put him exactly where he sat today. I spent 40 years inhaling sawdust and breathing in drywall dust. I worked 16 hours a day as a carpenter and general contractor, dragging my exhausted body home long after the streetlights flickered on. I remember the freezing Brooklyn nights when I would sit at the kitchen table with my late wife Camille massaging my aching joints. I broke 3 fingers on my right hand framing houses in those bitter winters just to pay his tuition at a prestigious law school. Camille and I sacrificed our health, our comfort, and our youth, so Terrence would never have to swing a hammer or worry about his next meal. We taught him the value of hard work and the absolute necessity of integrity. Yet there he sat wearing a $4,000 suit, remaining completely mute while his entitled white wife humiliated his father in his own dining room. He chose to protect her fragile ego instead of demanding respect for the man who built his foundation. Terrence's cowardly silence cut far deeper than any insult Courtney could ever throw at me. A physical blow would have hurt less. In that quiet dining room, I realized my blind parental devotion had not created a strong man. It had created a weak opportunist willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood for the sake of an artificial social status. Courtney crossed her arms and glared down at me. "I think it is best if you leave right now," she demanded. "We have important guests arriving soon, and I need to clean up this mess." I looked her directly in the eyes. I did not yell. I did not throw my napkin or demand an apology from my son. Anger is an emotion reserved for people who feel powerless, and I possessed more power than anyone in that room could possibly comprehend. I simply stood up, pushing my chair back slowly until the wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I maintained a facial expression as cold and unreadable as solid ice. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and placed it neatly next to my untouched plate of food. "To cover the cost of the dry cleaning," I said in a completely flat tone. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the front hallway. I grabbed my worn canvas jacket off the coat rack and slipped it over my stained shirt. Behind me, the silence of the dining room remained unbroken. Terrence never called out my name. He never offered to walk me to the door. He simply let me walk away. I pulled the heavy oak door open and stepped out into the freezing November wind. The cold air was a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of their pristine dining room. I closed the door behind me with a firm, definitive click. There was no dramatic argument or screaming match to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. My absolute silence was a deliberate choice. It created a suffocating tension that I knew would linger in their house long after my departure. I walked down the stone pathway toward the sidewalk, feeling the icy air hit my face. Every step I took away from that property felt like a massive weight lifting off my shoulders. I was no longer bound by the obligation to protect a son who refused to respect me. I made it exactly halfway down the suburban block when I reached into my jacket pocket and realized my house keys were missing. I had left them sitting on the small console table in their entryway when I first arrived. I stopped in my tracks, let out a quiet sigh, and turned around. The autumn wind was biting, but my mind was perfectly clear. I walked back up their long, winding driveway, taking care to keep my footsteps quiet against the pavement. I bypassed the grand front door, knowing it locked automatically, and walked around to the side entrance near the kitchen. The kitchen window was cracked open slightly to let out the overwhelming heat from the massive oven. As I reached for the side door handle, I froze entirely. Muffled voices drifted through the narrow opening of the window. Courtney and Terrence were speaking in hushed, hurried tones. Their argument was not about my sudden departure, but about something far more sinister. I stood perfectly still in the shadows, pressing my back against the cold brick wall. I slipped my hand into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and silently activated the voice recording application. I held the device near the cracked window, capturing every single word of their conversation. The cold wind whipped around me, but I felt absolutely nothing. What I heard next instantly eradicated any remaining trace of paternal affection I held for my son. They were not just complaining about my presence. They were actively plotting against my life. A disgusting, highly calculated secret began to unravel right there in the dark, and I stood in the shadows recording every single poisonous syllable. My daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye during Thanksgiving dinner and said, "Do not bother coming to Christmas because you are just a troublesome old man." I spent Christmas in absolute silence. But at midnight on Christmas Eve, my son called me in a blind panic, screaming, "Dad, you are on Fox News. What did you do?" They all stared in shock. My name is Harrison Hayes. I am 69 years old, and my family made the ultimate mistake of judging a book by its worn-out cover. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach ungrateful family members a permanent lesson. The heavy porcelain turkey platter slammed against the dining table with a violent crack. Hot brown gravy sloshed over the pristine rim and splattered directly onto my faded flannel shirt. I did not flinch. I slowly looked up from my plate and met the furious blue eyes of my daughter-in-law, Courtney. She stood at the head of the table with her perfectly manicured hands resting aggressively on her hips, breathing heavily. Her blonde hair was styled to perfection for the upper-crust guest she planned to host later that evening. She raised her index finger and pointed it directly at my face. "You are ruining my holiday, Harrison," she snapped. Her voice was sharp and laced with pure, unadulterated venom. "I am absolutely tired of pretending everything is fine. You sit there in your cheap clothes acting like you belong in this neighborhood. Do not bother coming to our Christmas dinner next month. You are just a troublesome old black man who constantly clings to his son. My parents are bringing their elite country club friends for Christmas, and I will not have you sitting in my living room looking like a homeless contractor. You completely embarrass my family." The silence in the room became an absolute vacuum. I felt the hot gravy soaking through the thin fabric of my shirt against my chest. Courtney stood tall, radiating arrogance and entitlement. She firmly believed that her middle-class upbringing somehow elevated her above the man sitting quietly at her table. She looked at me with pure disgust, as if my presence alone contaminated the expensive air of the suburban mansion she lived in. I did not answer her immediately. Instead, I shifted my gaze to my son Terrence, who sat perfectly still at the opposite end of the long dining table. The boy I had raised from a fragile child into a grown man was staring intensely at his half-empty wine glass. He refused to look at me. He completely refused to defend the father who had given up everything to secure his future. The silence stretched on, and the crushing weight of his cowardice pressed the remaining air from my lungs. My mind flashed back through the decades of brutal physical labor I endured to put him exactly where he sat today. I spent 40 long years inhaling toxic sawdust and breathing in heavy drywall dust. I worked 16 hours a day as a carpenter and general contractor, dragging my exhausted body home long after the streetlights flickered on. I remember the freezing Brooklyn nights when I would sit at the kitchen table with my late wife Camille as she massaged my aching, swollen joints. I literally broke 3 fingers on my right hand framing houses in those bitter winters just to pay his expensive tuition at a prestigious law school. Camille and I sacrificed our health, our comfort, and our fleeting youth so Terrence would never have to swing a heavy hammer or worry about his next meal. We taught him the value of relentless hard work and the absolute necessity of personal integrity. Yet there he sat, wearing a $4,000 custom suit, remaining completely mute while his entitled wife humiliated his father in his own dining room. He chose to protect her fragile ego instead of demanding basic respect for the man who built his entire foundation. Terrence and his cowardly silence cut far deeper than any classist remark Courtney could ever throw at me. A physical blow to the jaw would have hurt significantly less. In that quiet dining room, I realized my blind parental devotion had not created a strong man. It had created a weak opportunist willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood for the sake of an artificial social status. Courtney crossed her arms over her chest and glared down at me with absolute contempt. "I think it is best if you leave my house right now," she demanded, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "We have important affluent guests arriving soon, and I need to clean up this disgusting mess before they get here." I looked her directly in the eyes. I did not yell. I did not throw my linen napkin or demand a frantic apology from my son. Anger is an emotion strictly reserved for people who feel powerless, and I possessed vastly more power than anyone in that room could possibly comprehend. I simply stood up, pushing my heavy wooden chair back slowly until the legs scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. I maintained a facial expression as cold and unreadable as solid winter ice. I reached into my denim pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and placed it neatly next to my untouched plate of food. "To cover the cost of the dry cleaning," I said in a completely flat tone that betrayed zero emotion. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the front hallway. I grabbed my worn canvas jacket off the brass coat rack and slipped it over my stained shirt. Behind me, the silence of the dining room remained entirely unbroken. Terrence never called out my name. He never offered to walk me to the door. He simply let me walk away like a discarded piece of trash. I pulled the heavy oak door open and stepped out into the freezing November wind. The cold air was a sharp contrast to the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of their pristine dining room. I closed the door behind me with a firm, definitive click. There was no dramatic argument or screaming match to give them the sick satisfaction of a reaction. My absolute silence was a highly deliberate choice. It created a suffocating, heavy tension that I knew would linger in their house long after my departure. I walked down the stone pathway toward the sidewalk, feeling the icy air hit my face. Every single step I took away from that property felt like a massive, heavy weight lifting off my tired shoulders. I was no longer bound by the obligation to protect a son who refused to respect me. I made it exactly halfway down the quiet suburban block when I reached into my jacket pocket and realized my house keys were missing. I had left them sitting on the small glass console table in their entryway when I first arrived. I stopped in my tracks, let out a quiet, frustrated sigh, and turned around. The autumn wind was biting, but my mind was perfectly clear and fiercely calculating. I walked back up their long, winding driveway, taking great care to keep my footsteps completely quiet against the pavement. I bypassed the grand front door, knowing it locked automatically, and walked around to the side entrance near the kitchen. The large kitchen window was cracked open slightly to let out the overwhelming heat from the massive roasting oven. As I reached for the side door handle, I froze entirely in place. Muffled, frantic voices drifted through the narrow opening of the window. Courtney and Terrence were speaking in hushed, hurried tones. Their argument was not about my sudden departure or the ruined Thanksgiving dinner, but about something far more sinister. I stood perfectly still in the dark shadows, pressing my back against the cold brick wall of the house. I slipped my hand into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and silently activated the voice recording application. I held the digital device near the cracked window, capturing every single spoken word of their private conversation. The cold wind whipped around my body, but I felt absolutely nothing. What I heard next instantly eradicated any remaining trace of paternal affection I held for my son. They were not just complaining about my presence or my clothes. They were actively plotting against my life and my freedom. A disgusting, highly calculated secret began to unravel right there in the dark, and I stood in the shadows recording every single poisonous syllable. I returned to my dark Brooklyn brownstone office later that night and sat in my heavy leather chair, the profound silence wrapping around me like a thick, suffocating blanket. The glowing screen of my laptop illuminated my calloused hands as I securely logged into the private portal of my personal retirement account. My original intention was straightforward and strictly disciplinary. I wanted to sever the minor financial safety nets I had occasionally provided for Terrence over the past few years to force him into basic accountability. But as the secure web page loaded, a completely unauthorized transaction glared back at me in stark, bold numbers. A second mortgage of exactly $50,000 had been finalized against this very brownstone just 3 short days prior. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the digitized legal paperwork with the sharp scrutiny of a seasoned corporate auditor. The digital signature securely stamped at the bottom of the electronic loan agreement was a flawless recreation of my own handwriting. My heart did not race in panic. It simply turned to solid, impenetrable ice. I pulled up the IP address log and the hidden device history attached to the electronic banking document. The transaction originated from a private wireless network registered directly to Terrence Hayes, my own son. The boy I had spent countless exhausted hours teaching the absolute importance of a man keeping his sacred word had casually committed federal wire fraud. He had forged my signature to blindly leverage my family home, likely to patch the massive bleeding hole of his wife and her endless credit card debt. The initial sharp sting of paternal betrayal quickly morphed into a cold, calculating, and dangerous clarity. Terrence was no longer my misguided or easily manipulated child. He was an active criminal threat operating under the fatal delusion that he was vastly smarter than the man who gave him life. The freezing morning sun broke through the heavy velvet curtains of my study, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I had not slept a single minute, but my energy was entirely boundless. At exactly 8 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated aggressively across the mahogany desk. The bright caller ID flashed Courtney. I let it ring 3 consecutive times, taking a slow, deep, calculated breath before pressing the answer button. "Good morning, Harrison," her voice chirped through the digital speaker. It was sickeningly sweet and entirely devoid of the toxic venom she had spat at me the night before. "I was just calling to make absolutely sure you got home safe. You left our house in such a terrible hurry last night, we were terribly worried about you." Her fake concern was a poorly constructed and insulting trap. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was actively probing for symptoms of advanced dementia to build her fabricated medical case against me. She desperately needed a documented history of confusion to justify throwing me into a state-run facility to steal my property. I decided to give her exactly the pathetic performance she so desperately desired. I let my voice waver slightly, deliberately dropping its usual firm and commanding cadence. "Hello, Courtney," I muttered, sounding distant, lost, and incredibly unsure. "Yes, I am home now. I am not quite sure how I got back, to be completely honest with you. I think I took a city cab, but my keys were mysteriously missing, and I stood outside in the freezing cold for a very long time." I distinctly heard the sharp intake of her breath over the phone, a silent gasp of absolute predatory triumph. "Oh my goodness, Harrison," she crooned, her voice dripping with artificial and condescending pity. "That is so incredibly dangerous. You are getting far too forgetful these days. We really need to talk about getting you some proper full-time medical care. You cannot keep wandering around confused and alone like this." I forced a small, pathetic, and exhausted sigh. "Maybe you are entirely right," I mumbled, playing the defeated, broken old man perfectly. "My memory is just not what it used to be. I am so terribly tired today." "We will take care of everything," she promised eagerly, her greed practically bleeding through the phone line. "Just rest, Harrison. We will handle all the heavy lifting." I ended the call abruptly and tossed the phone onto the desk, a sharp, predatory smirk breaking across my aged face. Courtney genuinely believed she was brilliantly outsmarting a frail, helpless, and uneducated carpenter. In her incredibly shallow mind, I was nothing more than a stubborn, useless relic of the working class who had overstayed his welcome on this earth. She looked at my faded denim jeans, my deeply scuffed work boots, and my modest, quiet lifestyle, and saw an incredibly easy target. She saw a defeated man who survived on a fixed government pension and clipped grocery coupons just to make basic ends meet. She possessed absolutely no conceptual idea of who she had just threatened. Camille and I had made a highly deliberate choice decades ago to live quietly, invisibly, and far below our actual means. We understood early on that flashy, visible wealth attracts vicious vultures and relentless parasites. Courtney did not know that the rough, calloused hands she found so utterly repulsive had personally signed off on billion-dollar commercial real estate acquisitions across the country. She did not know that the dusty, aging pickup truck I drove to her pristine suburban neighborhood was a conscious and highly strategic disguise. I am the sole founder and the anonymous majority shareholder of Apex Holdings. My invisible corporation controls a massive percentage of the commercial real estate market across the entire eastern seaboard. The very luxury high-rise building where Courtney eagerly shops for her overpriced designer handbags pays monthly rent directly to my corporate accounts. The elite architectural firm that employs her pretentious father relies entirely on massive development contracts approved exclusively by my board of directors. I possess the raw financial power to completely crush their entire existence with a single unrecorded phone call. They fatally mistook my profound humility for pathetic weakness. They interpreted my calculated silence as profound ignorance. I had spent 40 grueling years building an untouchable empire from the ground up, surviving ruthless corporate wars and destroying highly aggressive business rivals. Now this dangerously entitled woman and my deeply compromised son foolishly believed they could simply steal my historic home and lock me away in a forgotten ward. The time for playing the passive, heavily disappointed father had officially and permanently expired. I walked slowly over to the heavy iron safe hidden securely behind the massive oak bookshelf in my private study. I spun the mechanical dial, entering the complex combination with rapid, flawless precision. The heavy metal doors swung open, revealing tall stacks of classified corporate documents and a sleek, black, encrypted satellite phone. I only ever used this specific device for matters of absolute executive urgency. I pulled the secure phone from its charging cradle and dialed a highly restricted private number. The secure line did not even ring twice before it was immediately answered. A sharp, deeply respectful, and hyper-alert voice came through the encrypted channel. "Yes, Mr. Chairman," the man answered, immediately recognizing my dedicated signal. It was Jonathan Reed. Jonathan was the chief legal counsel for Apex Holdings and universally feared as the most ruthless corporate attorney in the entire state of New York. He was a brilliant man who regularly destroyed lives and completely dismantled rival corporations long before he finished his morning coffee. Jonathan said, my voice instantly dropping the fragile old man act entirely and returning to its natural, deeply commanding resonance. "Cancel your morning board meetings and completely clear your professional schedule for the remainder of the week. I have a highly sensitive personal matter that requires your immediate and completely undivided attention." "Of course," Sir Jonathan replied without a single moment of hesitation or question. "Who are we going after today?" I looked out the large window at the freezing Brooklyn streets, my facial expression hardening into absolute unforgiving stone. "We are going after my son Terrence and his manipulative wife Courtney," I stated coldly. "I need you to pull every single financial record, every credit report, and every employment contract attached to their names. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. I want their entire fabricated world dismantled piece by piece. I will be at the corporate headquarters in exactly 1 hour. Be ready, Jonathan. The hunt has officially begun." I stepped out of my private town car and stared up at the towering glass and steel monolith of Apex Holdings dominating the Manhattan skyline. I bypassed the crowded main lobby filled with rushing employees and used my encrypted keycard to access the secure executive elevator. When the polished metal doors slid open on the 50th floor, the bustling atmosphere of the executive suite instantly froze. Highly paid regional directors and aggressive portfolio managers immediately stopped their conversations and bowed their heads in deep, silent respect as I walked past. They knew exactly who held their incredibly lucrative careers in the palm of his hand. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to my private corner office overlooking the entire city. Jonathan Reed was already standing perfectly straight beside my massive desk. His normally impenetrable face was tight with extreme professional tension. He did not offer a polite greeting or engage in meaningless small talk to waste my valuable time. He simply placed a remarkably thick black dossier directly in the center of my desk. I sat down in my leather chair and stared at the heavy folder. I demanded he tell me exactly what he found. Jonathan adjusted his expensive silk tie and slid the file closer to my hands. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register, "your son is entirely bankrupt. He maxed out every single credit card attached to his name, and his wife has opened 6 more using completely fraudulent income statements. but that is unfortunately the least of his current legal problems. I opened the heavy folder and began flipping through the highly detailed financial forensics. The numbers printed on the crisp white paper were not just the chaotic result of reckless suburban spending. They were the undeniable digital footprints of a very sloppy corporate criminal. My eyes scanned the highlighted bank statements and internal corporate ledgers tracking a highly complex web of illegal money transfers. Terrence was not just drowning in his wife and her insatiable demand for absolute luxury. He was actively committing massive corporate fraud on a terrifying scale. I read the name of the victimized company printed clearly at the top of the fraudulent invoices, and a sharp, bitter laugh escaped my lips. Terrence was employed as a mid-level director at a prominent commercial logistics firm. He had spent the last 8 months systematically creating fake vendor accounts and approving payments for phantom construction materials that never existed. He had successfully funneled exactly $200,000 directly into offshore holding accounts to feed Courtney and her highly expensive country club lifestyle. He truly thought he was a brilliant criminal mastermind outsmarting a faceless corporate entity. What my incredibly foolish son did not know was that the logistics firm he was actively robbing was a direct subsidiary of Apex Holdings. He was aggressively stealing from my own corporate empire. He was legally robbing the very father he treated like absolute garbage. He sat at my Thanksgiving table ignoring his wife insulting my clothes while quietly embezzling $200,000 of my own corporate funds to finance her fake aristocratic life. The sheer magnitude of his absolute stupidity was almost difficult to process. I stared at the forged invoices bearing my son and his sloppy, uncoordinated signature. I had spent 40 years building a completely bulletproof corporate structure designed to violently crush anyone who attempted to steal a single cent from my board of directors. My son had unknowingly walked directly into the deadliest financial bear trap in the entire country. Jonathan leaned forward, pointing to a specific cluster of offshore routing numbers printed on the 3rd page. We caught the extreme discrepancy during a routine quarterly audit, he explained coldly. We tracked the stolen funds directly back to his personal domestic accounts. We have absolutely undeniable proof of systemic embezzlement and highly aggravated wire fraud. I can have the federal authorities arrest him at his office within the next hour, Jonathan stated with absolute legal certainty. I have the drafted criminal complaint completely ready for your final authorization signature. He will face a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary for this level of corporate theft. I closed the thick black folder and rested my calloused hands flat against the cool surface of the mahogany desk. No, I replied, my voice echoing with a dangerous, quiet authority. Do not call the federal authorities. Do not alert the local police department just yet. Jonathan blinked in rare, absolute confusion. Sir, with all due respect, he is actively stealing your corporate capital. We must neutralize the immediate financial threat before he drains more accounts. I looked sharply at my ruthless attorney. Prison is an incredibly easy escape for a pathetic coward, I explained coldly. If we lock him in a federal cell right now, Courtney will simply play the tragic innocent victim for the media. She will divorce him, take half of whatever is left, and move on to her next wealthy suburban target. Her arrogant father will use his business connections to distance their pristine white family from the disgraced black husband. I will absolutely not allow them to escape this total destruction completely unscathed. I built this massive empire with my bare hands and the unyielding support of my late wife, Camille. She constantly warned me that giving Terrence too much unearned comfort would eventually breed profound weakness. I ignored her warnings and allowed that highly manipulative woman to twist my son into a pathetic, desperate thief. I want them to lose their pristine house. I want them to lose their fake social standing. I want to systematically strip away every single ounce of unearned arrogance from Courtney and her deeply pretentious family. I want them completely terrified, entirely bankrupt, and utterly humiliated before I drop the final legal hammer. We are going to bleed them entirely dry from the inside out and watch them absolutely crumble. I pulled a heavy platinum pen from my breast pocket and pulled a blank executive directive form across the smooth desk. I wrote a highly specific operational order and signed my name with sharp, aggressive strokes that cut into the thick paper. Send Marcus Vance into the logistics subsidiary tomorrow morning, I commanded, handing the official paper directly to Jonathan. Marcus was the most aggressive forensic auditor on the entire Apex payroll, known universally for completely gutting executive departments and destroying corrupt managers. Tell him to initiate a massive surprise audit of all vendor payments. I want Terrence completely trapped in a state of absolute paranoia. Let him watch the digital walls close in around him, knowing the missing $200,000 is about to be violently uncovered. Let him sweat in absolute terror. Jonathan took the signed directive, and a sharp, predatory smile finally broke across his usually stoic face. "It will be executed immediately, sir," he promised, securing the document. I stood up and walked out of the towering glass building, leaving the massive corporate machinery of Apex Holdings to begin its silent, lethal work. I took my private car back to the quiet, working-class streets of Brooklyn, stepping back into my humble, brilliant disguise. I slipped my faded canvas jacket back on and walked into my historic brownstone, ready to play the role of the defeated, ignorant old man. The house was perfectly silent, but the ultimate war had officially commenced. I barely had time to pour myself a glass of cold water when the heavy brass doorbell suddenly rang. It was an aggressive, impatient, piercing sound. I walked slowly to the front entrance and pulled open the heavy wooden door. Courtney stood on my front porch wearing a highly expensive designer coat and holding a large stack of glossy brochures. Her unexpected hostile arrival was the exact psychological trap I had been waiting for. Courtney did not wait for an invitation to enter my home. She pushed past me into the narrow foyer of my historic Brooklyn brownstone, carrying a cheap plastic grocery bag in one hand and a thick stack of glossy magazines in the other. The overwhelming scent of her expensive floral perfume instantly clashed with the comforting, familiar smell of aged oak and lemon oil that defined my sanctuary. She marched directly into my kitchen, her designer heels clicking sharply and aggressively against the vintage floorboards. I closed the front door quietly and followed her, maintaining the slow, shuffling gait of an exhausted old man. She dropped the plastic bag onto my wooden dining table with a heavy, disrespectful thud. 2 cans of generic low-sodium chicken soup rolled out onto the polished surface, stopping near the edge. "I brought you some lunch since you clearly cannot manage to take care of yourself properly anymore," she announced without bothering to look at me. She then slapped the stack of glossy magazines down next to the soup. They were brochures for various state-run assisted living facilities. The covers featured overly cheerful elderly people sitting in sterile, depressing white rooms. Right on top of those insulting brochures, she placed a crisp, white legal document. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney. "I want you to read this carefully, Harrison," she instructed, crossing her arms over her expensive cashmere coat. "Your memory is rapidly failing. You forgot your keys at our house last night, and you wandered around in the freezing cold like a lost child. Terrence and I have discussed this extensively. You are becoming a massive liability to yourself. We need legal authorization to manage your health and your daily financial affairs before you accidentally burn this historic house to the ground." Her audacity was nothing short of breathtaking. She stood in the very house I bought with blood and sweat, brazenly attempting to strip away my fundamental human rights under the guise of fake concern. I looked down at the legal document, pretending to be entirely overwhelmed by the dense legal jargon printed on the page. "What exactly does this mean, Courtney?" I asked, letting my voice drop to a fragile, nervous whisper. "It means you are going to sign over control of your entire estate to Terrence," she replied, her tone shifting from fake concern to absolute icy authority. "Let me be perfectly clear with you so there is no confusion. If you refuse to sign this document voluntarily, Terrence and I will immediately file a petition in family court. We will have a judge declare you legally incompetent. We will drag you through a lengthy, humiliating psychological evaluation and force the state to strip you of your autonomy. You will lose everything anyway." She took a step closer, invading my personal space with predatory confidence. "But if you make this easy and sign the paper right now, I will do you a massive favor. We will sell this outdated brownstone to my father. He has a commercial development company that can tear it down and build something actually profitable on this lot. In exchange for your full cooperation, I will personally allow you to move into the basement of our house. We have a small storage room down there next to the furnace. It has a tiny window, and we can put a cot in there for you. You will be out of the way, but you will be completely safe. You should be immensely grateful, Harrison. Most daughters-in-law would just throw you directly into a crowded public ward and forget your name. I am offering you a roof over your head." I slowly raised my head and looked directly at her hands. She was pointing at the signature line on the legal document, tapping the paper impatiently. Her fingernails were freshly manicured, painted in a flawless, pristine white polish with tiny gold accents near the cuticles. That single manicure likely cost more than the cheap canned groceries she just threw on my table. I stared at those perfectly groomed hands and thought about the $50,000 forged second mortgage currently sitting in my secure bank file. I thought about how those very hands were currently gripping stolen credit cards, actively draining my wealth to finance her artificial aristocratic reality. She was offering me a damp concrete storage room in a house that I was secretly subsidizing with my own corporate funds. The profound evil radiating from this woman was almost fascinating to observe. I needed her to fully commit to her criminal extortion on the record. I forced my broad, muscular shoulders to slump forward, drastically reducing my physical presence. I allowed my right hand to tremble violently as I reached out and touched the edge of the power of attorney document. "You would really take me to court?" I asked, my voice cracking with perfectly executed artificial fear. "You would really put me in a state facility if I refused to give you my home?" Courtney smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the ruthless grin of a predator watching its trapped prey finally surrender. "I will do whatever is absolutely necessary to secure my family and our financial future," she stated without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. "I strongly suggest you grab a pen and sign the paper." I pulled my trembling hand back and clutched it tightly to my chest. "I need time," I muttered, looking down at the wooden floor to hide the intense, lethal calculation burning brightly in my eyes. "This is a very big decision for a man my age. Please, Courtney, give me just a few days to read through these complicated papers. I am so tired today. My mind is incredibly foggy and I cannot concentrate." Courtney let out a sharp, victorious exhale. She had seen my shaking hands and heard my broken voice. She firmly believed she had completely shattered my spirit and won the war. "Fine," she snapped, adjusting her designer coat and grabbing her expensive leather handbag. "You have until Monday. If this document is not signed and officially notarized by Monday morning, we file the incompetency petition with the judge. Enjoy your canned soup, Harrison." She turned on her heel and strutted out of my kitchen, the heavy front door slamming loudly behind her. I stood in the dead silence of my kitchen for a full minute, ensuring her luxury vehicle had pulled out of my driveway. Once the street was entirely quiet, my trembling hands instantly steadied. My slumped shoulders straightened, pushing my frame back to its full imposing height. I reached up and tapped the top black button of my faded flannel shirt. It was not a standard plastic clothing button. It was a military-grade, high-definition micro camera directly linked to a secure encrypted cloud server at Apex Holdings. I had successfully recorded every single second of her blatant extortion, every threat regarding my mental capacity, and every disgusting detail of her plan to steal my property for her father. My phone vibrated aggressively in my pocket, breaking the silence. I pulled it out and read a new text message from Terrence. "Dad, I booked a mandatory doctor appointment for you tomorrow morning at 10. We need to get your memory properly evaluated before things get worse. Do not be late." I stared at the glowing screen, a cold, devastating smile forming slowly on my lips. The medical trap was fully set. They were finally making their aggressive move to declare me insane. They had absolutely no idea they were walking blindly into a professional execution. Terrence picked me up promptly at 9 the next morning. He drove in tense silence, his knuckles gripping the leather steering wheel of his expensive leased SUV. He did not ask how I slept or how I was feeling. He simply treated me like a problematic piece of cargo that needed to be dropped off at a designated processing facility. He pulled into the parking lot of a sleek private medical clinic in a highly affluent part of the city. The brass plaque on the pristine glass door read, "Dr. Richard Vance, Neurology and Cognitive Health." Terrence guided me into the waiting room with a firm hand on my shoulder, playing the role of the deeply concerned, devoted son for the receptionist. We were ushered into an examination room almost immediately. Dr. Vance walked in wearing a tailored white coat and a perfectly practiced smile that did not quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. He was a man who clearly enjoyed the lucrative benefits of private medicine. I knew exactly who he was, and more importantly, I knew exactly why I was sitting on his examination table. Courtney had not left this critical medical evaluation to chance. She had actively sought out a physician whose ethical boundaries were entirely flexible for the right price. She had bribed this incredibly arrogant doctor to ensure I received a heavily documented diagnosis of early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Terrence stood in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, trying to look solemnly troubled as the doctor began pulling out his standardized cognitive testing charts. They thought they had backed an ignorant, helpless old man into a permanent corner. They were completely unaware that they had just walked onto my personal chessboard. Before Dr. Vance could even begin asking his deeply condescending memory questions, Terrence felt his phone vibrate aggressively in his pocket. He pulled it out and his face paled slightly when he saw the caller ID. It was likely one of his deeply panicked creditors, or perhaps the forensic auditors I had unleashed on his department. "Excuse me for just one moment," Dr. Terrence said, slipping out of the examination room and pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him. We were completely alone. Dr. Vance leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his legs and adopting a highly patronizing tone. "Well, Harrison," he began, slowly enunciating every single syllable as if he were speaking to a severely delayed toddler. "I am going to ask you some very simple questions today. Do you know what day of the week it is? Can you tell me the current president's name?" I stared at him, my shoulders instantly straightening and the artificial fog lifting completely from my eyes. I did not give him a confused or frightened answer. I leaned forward, resting my large hands on my knees, and looked directly into his soul. "Today is Thursday, November 29th. I stated, my voice resonating with absolute terrifying authority. "The current political administration is completely irrelevant to this conversation. What is highly relevant, however, is your corporate tax identification number ending in 4729. What is also incredibly relevant is the 10-year commercial lease agreement you signed on this exact medical suite, which specifically stipulates a monthly rental payment of $14,500. I watched the patronizing smile slide completely off his face, replaced by a sudden sharp wave of profound confusion. I did not stop. "Furthermore, Richard, you are currently in direct violation of Section 4, Paragraph B of that exact lease agreement due to consecutive non-payment." Dr. Vance dropped his expensive pen onto the tiled floor, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The arrogant medical professional suddenly realized he was no longer the smartest man in the room. "You see, Richard," I continued, speaking in a low, highly measured tone that demanded absolute silence. "You foolishly believed my desperate daughter-in-law when she handed you an envelope of stolen cash to destroy my life. You thought you were dealing with a helpless working-class relic. You completely failed to do your basic due diligence. This entire medical plaza, this pristine glass building where you overcharge your wealthy, desperate patients, is owned entirely by a commercial holding subsidiary. That subsidiary is wholly owned and aggressively managed by Apex Holdings. I am the anonymous founder and the absolute majority shareholder of that massive corporation. I am your landlord. I am the man who holds the actual deed to your entire professional existence." Dr. Vance gripped the edges of his desk, his knuckles turning completely white. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He swallowed hard, the brutal reality of his fatal mistake crushing him instantly. "You are currently exactly 3 months behind on your commercial rent," Richard, I stated coldly, leaning even closer. "My legal department drafted your official eviction notice 48 hours ago. They are preparing to seize your expensive medical equipment to cover your outstanding debts. You are standing on the absolute precipice of total financial and professional ruin, and you just accepted a pathetic cash bribe to commit severe medical fraud against your own landlord." His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. He looked at the closed door, terrified that my son would walk back in, and then looked back at me with eyes full of absolute, unadulterated panic. "Please, Mr. Hayes," he stammered, his voice shaking violently. "I had absolutely no idea who you were. They told me you were just a confused old man. I am so terribly sorry. I am drowning in massive debt. I needed the money to survive." His pathetic groveling was utterly disgusting. He had been perfectly willing to completely destroy an innocent elderly man for a few $1,000s just minutes ago. His sworn medical oath meant absolutely nothing to him. I raised my hand, silencing his pathetic, desperate apologies instantly. "I do not care about your financial struggles or your severe lack of basic medical ethics." I commanded, my voice slicing through the clinical air like a razor blade. "You are going to do exactly what I tell you to do right now, or I will have my legal team completely destroy your medical license and ensure you spend the next decade in a federal prison for medical extortion." He nodded frantically, sweat beading on his forehead, completely eager to save his own miserable skin. "You are going to print out the official diagnosis of severe cognitive decline just as my son requested," I instructed, leaning back and crossing my arms. "You will hand him that official document when he walks back into this room. You will look him dead in the eye and tell him that I require immediate full-time supervision. You will give them exactly the false victory they paid you for." Dr. Vance blinked in heavy confusion but nodded rapidly, agreeing to my bizarre terms. And then I continued, my eyes locking onto his terrified face. "You are going to hand me the digital security footage from the hidden camera in your office. Do not even try to lie to me, Richard. I know desperate men like you always record illegal bribes to use as potential leverage later. I want the complete audio and video file of Courtney and Terrence paying you to forge my medical records. You will transfer that highly incriminating file directly to my secure corporate server right now." The doctor scrambled to his computer, his hands shaking violently as he quickly bypassed his own security protocols to obey my direct command. The medical trap was now perfectly set. My family firmly believed they had finally secured the ultimate weapon to lock me away forever. They had no idea they were holding the very loaded gun that would permanently end their lives. 2 days after the incident at the medical clinic, my secure phone vibrated with an unexpected text message from Richard Montgomery. Courtney and her relentless ambition clearly came from her arrogant father. Richard was a man who essentially sweated cheap cologne and radiated unearned suburban superiority. He aggressively requested my immediate presence at Le Bernardin, an obscenely expensive French restaurant located deep in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. He claimed we urgently needed to have a private man-to-man discussion regarding the financial future of our children. I knew exactly what this pompous commercial contractor actually wanted, but I deliberately agreed to the meeting to observe his specific brand of corporate greed firsthand. I arrived at the restaurant wearing the exact same faded flannel shirt and heavily scuffed leather work boots that had so deeply offended his entitled daughter on Thanksgiving. The impeccably dressed maitre d' visibly stiffened when I walked through the heavy gold-plated front doors, but Richard quickly waved me over from a highly secluded corner booth. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit and aggressively swirling a glass of amber scotch. "Sit down, Harrison," he commanded, pointing a manicured finger toward the plush velvet chair directly opposite him. "I did not order you a drink because I naturally assume you prefer tap water over a $100 glass of single malt." I took my seat in absolute silence, watching his predatory eyes scan my working-class attire with undisguised contempt. He did not waste time with polite formalities or fake pleasantries. He leaned across the pristine white tablecloth and folded his hands. "I am a very busy man, so I will get straight to the point," he stated smoothly. "Courtney tells me your cognitive health is rapidly declining and you are struggling to maintain that decaying property in Brooklyn. I own a highly successful commercial development firm. I am willing to do my son-in-law a massive favor. I will purchase your historic brownstone for a flat cash offer of $300,000 right now and take the burdensome property completely off your failing hands." $300,000 was barely a tenth of what the historic property was actually worth in the heavily gentrified Brooklyn real estate market. He was attempting to openly rob me to my face under the incredibly thin veil of family charity. I looked at him, maintaining a completely blank and unreadable expression. "That is an incredibly low offer for a prime piece of historic real estate." Richard Risch replied, my voice perfectly level. He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that immediately drew irritated glances from the surrounding wealthy patrons. "Let us be brutally honest here, Harrison," he sneered, leaning back in his expensive chair. "Look at yourself. You are wearing a shirt that belongs in a charity donation bin. You spent your entire life hammering cheap nails and inhaling toxic sawdust. You do not understand the complex realities of the modern commercial real estate market. $300,000 is more money than a retired carpenter like you has ever seen in one single place. You should be down on your knees thanking me for bailing out your ungrateful son and your deteriorating mind." He took a long, arrogant sip of his expensive scotch, relishing the sound of his own pretentious voice. "My development company is about to secure the most lucrative commercial construction contract in the history of this city," he bragged loudly, puffing out his chest to emphasize his supposed dominance. "We are the leading bidders for the massive waterfront redevelopment project downtown. Once that massive contract is officially signed, my firm will secure tens of millions in pure operational profit. I operate in a completely different financial stratosphere than you, Harrison. You are a dying breed of obsolete physical laborers. I am a visionary corporate builder. You need my charity to survive your final pathetic years. If you refuse my highly generous cash offer, My aggressive legal team will simply help Courtney and Terrence seize the property through the local court system once you are officially committed to a state medical facility. I calmly reached for the heavy crystal glass of complimentary tap water the waiter had nervously placed in front of me. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cool liquid wash down my throat. I did not blink. I did not react to his blatant classist insults or his direct legal threats. My mind was entirely focused on the specific name of the commercial construction project he had just so proudly mentioned, the Waterfront Redevelopment Initiative. It was a massive multi-billion-dollar urban revitalization project designed to completely transform the eastern city skyline. I knew absolutely every single intricate detail of that massive construction initiative. I knew the exact cubic tonnage of steel required. I knew the precise architectural blueprints. I knew these things because the entire waterfront redevelopment project was solely financed, funded, and managed by Apex Holdings. Richard Montgomery firmly believed he was aggressively intimidating a clueless, helpless old man. He had absolutely no idea he was currently sitting across the table from the supreme financial architect of the very project he needed to save his failing construction firm. I had personally reviewed the bidding portfolio from Montgomery Construction just 2 weeks prior. My internal risk assessment team had clearly flagged his company for severe liquidity issues and a highly concerning lack of operational capital. Richard was currently drowning in massive commercial debt exactly like his entitled daughter. He desperately needed that Apex contract to save his business from total catastrophic bankruptcy, and he desperately needed to steal my Brooklyn brownstone to quickly generate the cash required to secure his initial operational bonds. The absolute poetry of this specific situation was almost beautiful. He was threatening to destroy my life using the false promise of a corporate contract that required my personal executive signature to become reality. He was a dead man bragging loudly about the expensive quality of his own coffin. I sat there letting him bask in his false sense of absolute superiority. He saw a vulnerable elderly victim ripe for total financial slaughter, while I looked at a desperate, pathetic fraud who was about to lose everything he had ever built. I set the crystal water glass back down on the pristine white tablecloth, making sure it landed with a sharp, definitive click. I looked Richard Montgomery directly in his cold, arrogant eyes. "I do not require your highly insulting charity," Richard restated, my voice resonating with an icy, absolute authority that made his confident smirk falter slightly. "And I will never sell my historic family home to a desperate, over-leveraged contractor who builds cheap, inadequate commercial structures. You cannot even manage your own massive corporate debt. You have absolutely no business trying to manage my personal estate." I stood up from the velvet chair towering over him. "Keep your dirty money and your pathetic legal threats. You are going to need every single penny very soon." I turned and walked out of the elegant restaurant, leaving him sputtering in completely shocked silence. I did not look back. I stepped out into the freezing Manhattan night, the sharp, cold air solidifying my absolute resolve. I pulled the encrypted satellite phone from my heavy canvas jacket and opened the secure messaging application. I did not need to make a long, dramatic phone call. I only needed a few specific keystrokes to completely eradicate an arrogant man from the corporate map. I typed a single direct message to Jonathan Reed. "Revoke Montgomery Construction from the waterfront project bidding list immediately. Permanently blacklist his firm from all future Apex Holdings contracts. Freeze their active credit lines." I hit send and watched the encrypted message disappear into the digital ether. The confirmation receipt flashed on the bright screen less than 2 seconds later. Richard Montgomery truly thought he could brutally bully a retired carpenter out of his lifelong home. He was about to wake up tomorrow morning and discover that his entire corporate empire had been instantly vaporized by the very man he had just mocked. The fallout from a single encrypted message is immediate and absolute. At exactly 8 in the morning, the corporate guillotine dropped heavily on Richard Montgomery and his fragile construction empire. I sat in my quiet kitchen sipping black coffee as I received the official secure confirmation from Jonathan Reed. Apex Holdings had officially and formally withdrawn the massive waterfront development contract from Montgomery Construction. The secondary fatal blow hit him less than 10 minutes later when our affiliated financial institutions completely froze his massive commercial credit lines due to a sudden lack of secured projected income. His company was instantly and effectively dead in the water. Through the advanced audio surveillance I had previously installed on my own son and his phone account, I listened to the chaotic aftermath unfold in real time. Richard called Courtney in a state of absolute raving hysteria. His pretentious, arrogant demeanor was completely gone, replaced by the frantic screaming of a cornered, terrified animal. "They pulled the contract, Courtney," he screamed through the phone, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "The bank froze every single operating account I have. I cannot make payroll on Friday. I am completely ruined." He did not ask for her sympathy or offer paternal comfort. He immediately and aggressively demanded her absolute compliance. "You need to get that decrepit brownstone out of your stubborn father-in-law right now," he commanded violently. "I need that cash to satisfy the bank before they seize my heavy equipment. I do not care if you have to drag him to the courthouse by his gray hair. You force him to sign the property over, or we are all going out on the street." Courtney was stammering, crying heavily, struggling to process how her wealthy, invincible father had been financially decimated overnight. I listened to her hyperventilate, realizing her pristine, aristocratic safety net had just been completely vaporized. While Courtney was having a complete mental breakdown over her father and his sudden financial collapse, an entirely different kind of profound terror was engulfing my son. Across the city, in the sleek offices of the logistics subsidiary, the forensic auditor Marcus Vance had arrived precisely at 9 in the morning. Marcus did not knock or introduce himself politely. He simply walked into the executive suite, locked the department doors, and immediately seized every single financial hard drive in the building. He froze all outgoing transactions and demanded physical copies of every vendor invoice from the past 12 months. Terrence was sitting at his desk when the aggressive audit began. I knew exactly when the devastating reality hit him because my personal cell phone began ringing relentlessly. It rang 5 times in rapid succession before I finally answered it. The voice on the other end of the line was completely unrecognizable. It was not the voice of the arrogant executive who sat silently while his wife insulted me at the Thanksgiving table. It was the high-pitched, pathetic whimpering of a terrified little boy caught stealing from the cookie jar. "Dad, please, you have to help me," Terrence begged, hyperventilating so hard he could barely form complete sentences. "There are auditors here, corporate auditors from the main holding company. They are tearing through my vendor files. They found the discrepancies, Dad. They found the missing $200,000. I remained perfectly silent, letting his profound panic echo through the digital connection. "Dad, please say something," he cried out, his voice echoing off the tiled walls of whatever bathroom stall he was hiding in. "I am going to prison. They are going to lock me in a federal cell. You have to sell the brownstone today. You have to wire me the cash so I can replace the stolen funds before they finalize the official report. Please, Dad, I am begging you. I will do anything you want. I will make Courtney apologize to you on her knees. Just please save my life." I did not answer his pathetic, desperate pleas immediately. I slowly walked out of my kitchen and moved into the front hallway, standing quietly in front of a framed photograph of my late wife, Camille. In the picture, we were standing on the front steps of this very brownstone, young, exhausted, but incredibly proud. We had absolutely nothing back then except a fierce work ethic and a profound dedication to building a solid foundation for our only son. I looked into her beautiful resting eyes and silently asked for her forgiveness for what I was about to do. Camille had always possessed a much sharper instinct for human nature than I did. She used to tell me that shielding a growing boy from the harsh consequences of his own reckless actions was not an act of love, but an act of deep parental sabotage. She warned me that true discipline required immense personal sacrifice. I finally understood the profound gravity of her wisdom. The absolute most expensive lessons in this brutal world are strictly paid for with unyielding ruthlessness. Sparing Terrence from the absolute destruction he had intentionally brought upon himself would only validate his sickening entitlement. He needed to be burned completely to the ground so he could finally understand the actual value of the ashes. I pulled the phone back up to my mouth, keeping my eyes locked on the smiling face of my departed wife. My voice was completely devoid of any paternal warmth or protective instinct. It was the cold, highly calculated tone of a corporate executioner. "Terrence," I stated calmly, cutting through his frantic sobbing, "you are a grown man who made a highly calculated decision to commit severe corporate fraud. You stole $200,000 to finance a fake luxury lifestyle for a woman who looks down on the very blood running through your veins. You forged my signature to leverage the only home your mother and I ever truly owned. You brought this entire catastrophe upon yourself." Terrence gasped, choking violently on his own frantic tears. "Dad, you cannot just abandon me," he pleaded, his voice completely shattering. "We are family. You are my father. You are supposed to protect me from things like this." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that held absolutely zero joy. "Protect you?" I asked, my tone dropping to a lethal frozen whisper. "You made it incredibly clear at the Thanksgiving table exactly where I stand in your sophisticated new family dynamic. I am not a father to you or a savior to your wife." I paused, letting the heavy silence build the overwhelming tension before delivering the final fatal blow. "You need to remember exactly who you are talking to, Terrence. I am just a troublesome old black man who completely embarrasses your pristine family." A troublesome old black man does not possess the sophisticated financial ability to save the upper class from their own pathetic criminal mistakes. The sound that came out of Terrence was a primal, guttural wail of absolute despair. He finally realized that the bridge he had so casually burned was his only possible escape route from total annihilation. I did not wait for him to formulate another pathetic excuse or offer another meaningless, hollow apology. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button terminating the call instantly. I immediately went into the phone settings and permanently blocked his personal number. I then blocked Courtney and her deeply arrogant father. I completely severed every single line of communication, leaving them entirely trapped in the rapidly collapsing burning building of their own reckless design. The total radio silence would completely shatter their nerves. The agonizing countdown to their absolute destruction had officially commenced, and I intended to enjoy every single quiet moment of it. The days following my absolute silence were dedicated to tightening the invisible noose around their fragile necks. I did not just want to watch them struggle financially from a distance. I wanted absolute total control over the very roof they slept under. I summoned Jonathan Reed back to my Brooklyn study early Tuesday morning. I instructed him to completely bypass our standard corporate acquisition channels and create a temporary shell company strictly for one highly specific transaction. I handed him the physical property details of the sprawling suburban mansion Terrence and Courtney proudly called their own. They had financed that pristine house with a massive adjustable rate mortgage from a regional bank. I ordered Jonathan to aggressively purchase that exact debt portfolio regardless of the premium cost. The regional bank was more than eager to offload a high-risk mortgage, especially considering the primary borrower was currently being investigated internally for severe corporate fraud. Within 48 hours, the complex legal paperwork was fully finalized and quietly filed in the county records. I was no longer just the estranged father they had banished from their pristine dining room on Thanksgiving. I was legally and officially the sole owner of their suffocating massive debt. I held the absolute power to foreclose on their suburban sanctuary the very second they defaulted on a single monthly payment. They firmly thought they owned a fortress of upper-class security, but they were merely renting temporary space inside my personal financial prison. They were completely at my absolute mercy. Across the city, the crushing reality of their new absolute poverty was triggering a spectacular psychological meltdown. Through the discreet surveillance networks Jonathan had legally established, I monitored Courtney and her rapidly deteriorating mental state. She was completely frantic. With her father entirely bankrupt and her husband facing imminent termination, she attempted a desperate, massive liquidation of her precious designer assets. She began hauling thousands of dollars worth of luxury handbags, diamond watches, and custom jewelry to high-end consignment boutiques across Manhattan, hoping to secure fast, untraceable cash. But the absolute fatal blow landed when she attempted to discreetly access the 5 fraudulent credit cards she had maliciously opened using my stolen identity. She stood at a bank teller window, completely desperate to withdraw emergency cash advances to pay her furious father and keep their country club memberships active. Instead of handing her crisp bills, the bank manager calmly informed her that every single one of those specific accounts had been permanently frozen. I had personally flagged the accounts for severe identity theft 3 days prior. The manager looked Courtney directly in her panicked eyes and stated that the entire debt portfolio had already been officially transferred to a federal fraud investigation agency. He informed her that local authorities had been notified of the unauthorized access attempt and were currently dispatching officers to the branch to ask her some serious questions. She fled the pristine bank lobby in absolute sheer terror, leaving her fake designer sunglasses sitting on the counter and practically sprinting to her unpaid luxury vehicle. The wealthy, untouchable suburban housewife was suddenly reduced to a terrified petty criminal running from the harsh consequences of her own staggering arrogance. She had absolutely nowhere left to hide and zero financial resources left to save herself from the incoming storm. While my deeply ungrateful family desperately scrambled to survive the brutal financial apocalypse they had intentionally engineered, I was meticulously preparing for my final public execution. I sat in the grand executive boardroom of Apex Holdings, surrounded by my absolute top-tier public relations team. For 40 long years, I had successfully remained a complete phantom in the high-stakes corporate world. I intentionally let my aggressive chief executive officers serve as the visible public face of the massive empire, while I quietly controlled the absolute power from the shadows. But the highly specific nature of this profound family betrayal required a highly visible, entirely public reckoning. I instructed my director of corporate communications to directly contact the senior executive producers at Fox News. I authorized her to offer them the most exclusive, highly coveted financial interview of the entire decade. The anonymous billionaire founder of Apex Holdings, the man who controlled massive percentages of the Eastern Seaboard real estate market, was finally ready to step out of the shadows and reveal his true identity on national television. The network executives practically fought each other to secure the unprecedented broadcasting rights, agreeing to every single demand we listed. We strategically scheduled the live exclusive interview for a highly specific time slot. It would air live precisely at midnight on Christmas Eve. The ultimate holiday surprise for a family that had specifically banished me from their seasonal celebrations. I spent the following days undergoing intensive media training, sitting beneath harsh studio lights and practicing my vocal delivery. I looked at the sleek television monitors reflecting my image. I was no longer the exhausted carpenter in the faded flannel shirt. I wore a custom-tailored suit that radiated absolute, unforgiving power. I was sharpening the blade for a televised execution. The intricate web was almost flawlessly complete when my private corporate security director rushed into my office with an urgent, critical update. Terrence was fully aware that the internal corporate auditors were completely dismantling his fraudulent vendor accounts at the logistics subsidiary. The artificial walls of his pathetic criminal scheme had completely collapsed. But instead of accepting responsibility like a man, my son had chosen the ultimate path of a complete coward. He had contacted a highly notorious document forger operating deep within the criminal underworld. Terrence was aggressively attempting to purchase a completely fake passport and secure illegal passage out of the country before the final audit report was officially submitted to the executive board. He planned to completely abandon his incredibly entitled wife, his deeply bankrupt father-in-law, and his entire ruined life to hide like a frightened rat in a non-extradition country. He truly believed he could simply run away from the massive inferno he had ignited, leaving the women to face the incoming federal agents alone. I looked at the surveillance photographs showing my son handing a thick envelope of stolen cash to a known federal criminal in a dark parking garage. My heart did not break. It completely solidified into pure granite. I turned to Jonathan Reed, who was standing perfectly still, waiting for my final directive. "Do not wait for the internal audit to formally conclude," I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute lethal finality. "Package every single piece of financial evidence, the forged mortgage documents, the fake vendor invoices, and these new surveillance photographs. Send the entire comprehensive dossier directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Tell them an executive director at Apex Holdings is actively attempting to flee international borders to avoid massive wire fraud charges." The ultimate net was now completely cast. The evening of December 24th arrived with a heavy blanket of pristine white snow covering the quiet, historic streets of Brooklyn. Inside my massive brownstone, the silence was absolute and profoundly heavy. There were no festive holiday carols playing on a stereo system, and no familiar smell of roasting turkey wafting from the kitchen. I had explicitly forbidden my private household staff from decorating the property this year, giving them the week off with double pay. The artificial cheer of the holiday season felt completely unnecessary and deeply insulting when I was actively dismantling my own biological bloodline. I walked slowly over to the antique crystal decanter resting on my polished mahogany desk and poured myself a generous measure of 20-year-old vintage bourbon. The rich amber liquid glowed warmly under the dim light of my brass reading lamp. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the complex, smoky burn wash down my throat and settle firmly in my chest. I carried the heavy crystal glass across the large room and settled deeply into my high back leather armchair. Directly in front of me sat a massive flat-screen television currently tuned to the national broadcast of the Fox News network. The volume was completely muted, but the bright crawling ticker at the bottom of the screen displayed endless updates about global financial markets and holiday travel delays. I sat in the complete darkness watching the silent digital anchors mouth their evening reports. The snow continued to fall heavily outside my tall windows, burying the entire city under a thick frozen layer of white ice. It was the perfect visual metaphor for the cold, suffocating avalanche I had methodically unleashed upon my deeply ungrateful family. I checked the heavy gold Rolex watch secured tightly around my left wrist. It was exactly 10 o'clock in the evening. The final agonizing countdown had officially begun, and I was enjoying every single second of the absolute quiet. Across the frozen city, an entirely different kind of holiday atmosphere was currently unfolding inside the sprawling suburban mansion I now legally and officially owned. Through the encrypted audio surveillance application actively running on my secure digital tablet, I listened intently to the spectacular implosion of their highly anticipated upper-crust Christmas Eve party. There were no wealthy country club executives laughing in their grand living room. There were no expensive catered appetizers or vintage champagne toasts. The elite socialites Courtney had so desperately wanted to impress had completely abandoned her the exact second vicious rumors of Richard and his massive financial collapse began circulating through their exclusive country club networks. The only people present in that massive echoing house were Terrence Courtney and her completely bankrupt father. The audio feed transmitted their vicious screaming match with pristine digital clarity. "You ruined my entire life, Terrence," I heard Courtney shriek, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria. "My platinum credit cards are declining at the grocery store. My wealthy friends will not even answer my text messages or my phone calls. You promised me a life of absolute luxury, and now we are entirely destitute." The loud shattering sound of breaking glass echoed through the tablet speakers as she likely hurled an expensive wine glass directly against the living room wall. Richard Montgomery immediately joined the verbal slaughter, barking at my son with absolute venom. "You are a pathetic, useless fraud, Terrence," he roared, his voice raspy from extreme stress and cheap liquor. "You told us your father was just a clueless retired carpenter sitting on a gold mine. You completely failed to secure that Brooklyn property, and now my entire commercial construction firm is dead. I am facing total liquidation because you could not handle one simple real estate transfer." Terrence screamed back, his voice trembling with sheer terror and highly defensive rage. "You are blaming me for your own pathetic business failures, Richard," he yelled at the top of his lungs. "I am the one facing federal corporate auditors tomorrow morning. I am the one who might spend the next decade in a federal prison cell while you two just complain about your lost social status." They were viciously tearing each other apart like starving wolves trapped in a tight cage, completely unaware that the ultimate hunter was listening to their every single agonizing breath. I calmly lowered the volume on the surveillance tablet, letting their pathetic, desperate screaming fade into a dull, meaningless background hum. The absolute contrast between their profound, chaotic panic and my complete, undisturbed tranquility was deeply poetic. They had spent their entire adult lives worshiping the hollow artificial illusion of wealth, aggressively chasing designer labels and elite social validation while actively despising the hard physical labor that actually builds empires. They falsely believed that real power was exclusively determined by the expensive zip code you resided in or the prestigious country club you belonged to. They were currently learning the hardest and most brutal lesson of human existence. True absolute power does not need to scream at the top of its lungs or throw glass against a wall. True power sits in complete silence, holding the undisputed legal deed to the very room where the screaming occurs. I placed my heavy bourbon glass on the side table and stood up, smoothing the crisp fabric of my clothing. I was not wearing my faded denim jeans or my heavily scuffed leather work boots tonight. I was impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit cut perfectly to my broad shoulders. Underneath the heavy suit jacket, I wore a pristine white silk shirt and a solid black silk tie. My shoes were polished Italian leather, reflecting the dim ambient light of the study. I had spent 40 long years deliberately disguising my massive wealth to protect my son from the corrosive, toxic nature of unearned privilege. Tonight, I was finally and permanently shedding that heavy, humble disguise. I was fully stepping into the absolute reality of who I actually was. I was Harrison Hayes, the anonymous founder and absolute majority shareholder of Apex Holdings. I was the financial titan who secretly dictated the commercial skyline of the entire eastern seaboard. I adjusted my cuffs, feeling the heavy weight of my platinum cufflinks against my wrists. I was not just preparing to make a national television appearance. I was dressing for a highly public corporate execution. I sat back down in my leather chair, picking up the television remote and raising the volume on the Fox News broadcast. The heavy antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of my study began its deep rhythmic chiming. It was exactly 11:55 in the evening. I fixed my eyes directly on the massive television screen. The standard financial programming abruptly cut away, fading into a solid black screen. A sharp, dramatic musical sting blasted heavily through the television speakers, and a massive, bold red graphic flashed aggressively across the screen. The words "breaking news" completely dominated the display. The prominent financial anchor appeared at the news desk, looking intensely serious and highly energized. "Good evening, America," the anchor announced, his voice carrying a heavy tone of unprecedented urgency. "We are immediately interrupting our standard holiday broadcast to bring you the most massive corporate reveal of the entire decade. For over 40 years, the multi-billion-dollar real estate empire known as Apex Holdings has been aggressively controlled by a completely anonymous founder. Tonight, that phantom billionaire is finally stepping out of the shadows for an exclusive live interview that will permanently shock the entire global financial market." The camera immediately cut to a sleek, pre-recorded promotional video showcasing the towering skyscrapers and massive commercial developments owned exclusively by my corporation. At that exact synchronized second, my encrypted satellite phone began to vibrate violently across the smooth surface of my mahogany desk. The timing was absolutely flawless. I did not need to look at the bright digital caller ID to know exactly who was desperately trying to reach me. Terrence had clearly seen the commercial teaser flashing across his own living room television screen. The federal walls were violently closing in on him, the auditors had completely gutted his fraudulent accounts, and now he was watching his ultimate doom broadcast live on national television. I picked up the vibrating device and stared at his name glowing brightly in the dark room. The television screen transitioned from the flashy corporate graphics back to the main studio where the prominent financial anchor sat leaning forward with intense anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," the anchor stated, looking directly into the camera lens with absolute gravity. "For the first time in the 40-year history of Apex Holdings, we finally have a face to match the massive corporate empire. Meet Harrison Hayes, the undisputed titan of commercial real estate and the sole anonymous architect of a multi-billion-dollar legacy." The broadcast immediately cut to a beautifully lit high-definition shot of me sitting in a plush studio chair wearing the exact charcoal gray Tom Ford suit I was currently wearing in my quiet Brooklyn study. The harsh studio lighting highlighted the sharp lines of my face, projecting a man who had ruthlessly conquered the business world. My expression on the television screen was incredibly calm, radiating an aura of absolute impenetrable authority. The bright lower third graphic flashed across the screen, spelling out my full name and my official title in bold lettering: Harrison Hayes, founder and chairman of Apex Holdings. The anchor began detailing the sheer magnitude of my financial portfolio, listing the iconic Manhattan skyscrapers, the massive urban development projects, and the sheer overwhelming volume of wealth I commanded from the shadows. The broadcast highlighted my humble beginnings, mentioning how a simple Brooklyn carpenter transformed a small local contracting business into an unstoppable global juggernaut. They displayed crisp aerial shots of the very waterfront redevelopment project that Richard Montgomery had so desperately needed to save his failing company. The announcer explicitly stated that my personal net worth eclipsed the gross domestic product of several developing nations. It was a flawless, utterly devastating presentation of raw, unadulterated power. The massive secret was officially out, and the shockwave was violently reverberating through every single affluent household in the country. The encrypted satellite phone continued to vibrate aggressively against the polished mahogany wood of my desk, demanding my immediate attention. I slowly tore my gaze away from the television screen and looked down at the glowing caller identification. Terrence was desperately trying to breach the digital wall I had built around myself. I had previously blocked his personal number, but he was calling through a highly secure corporate routing line he must have begged a panicked colleague to access. I reached out and picked up the heavy device, pressing the green illuminated button to accept the connection. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply brought the receiver to my ear and listened to the absolute chaos unfolding on the other side. Terrence was hyperventilating so violently I could hear his ragged, shallow breath scraping against the microphone like jagged sandpaper. "Dad," his voice cracked, shattering into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Dad, you are on Fox News. You are on the television right now. What the hell is going on?" He was stuttering uncontrollably, his brain completely short-circuiting as it tried to reconcile the massive cognitive dissonance. The man he had banished from his pristine Thanksgiving table, the man he believed was just a pathetic, bothersome old contractor, was currently staring back at him from national television as a confirmed billionaire. "Are you the founder of Apex?" he screamed, his voice dissolving into absolute sheer terror. "Tell me this is a joke. Tell me this is some kind of massive mistake. You are just a carpenter. You cannot be the chairman. You cannot be my ultimate boss." His entire fabricated reality had just been violently ripped out from under his feet. The massive corporate entity he had been actively embezzling from the shadowy board of directors he thought he was brilliantly outsmarting, it was all me. I was the absolute highest authority in his professional and personal universe. I let his frantic, panicked questions hang in the freezing air, allowing the crushing weight of his monumental stupidity to settle firmly onto his shoulders. Through the frantic static of the phone connection, I could vividly hear the spectacular psychological collapse of my daughter-in-law and her arrogant father. Courtney was shrieking in the background, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch that resembled a severely wounded animal. "He owns the company," she screamed at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the fact that her husband was currently on the phone. "Harrison owns Apex Holdings. He is a billionaire, Terrence. Your father is a literal billionaire, and you let me kick him out of our house. You let me call him a troublesome old man. We are completely ruined." The sound of something heavy crashing against a wall echoed through the receiver, followed immediately by the booming, furious voice of Richard Montgomery. "You arrogant, stupid boy," Richard roared, his voice completely raw with rage and absolute terror. I sat across a table from that man at Le Bernardin and threatened to steal his brownstone. I insulted his clothes. "He controls the waterfront project. He is the one who froze my corporate credit lines. He is the one who destroyed my entire company." The sheer, unadulterated panic in their voices was the sweetest symphony I had ever heard. Every single delusion of upper-class grandeur they held had been completely annihilated in a matter of seconds. Courtney had genuinely believed her middle-class upbringing made her infinitely superior to a working-class black man. Richard had genuinely believed his fragile construction firm gave him the ultimate authority to bully a retired carpenter. They had spent months looking down their aristocratic noses at me, judging my faded flannel shirts and my scuffed leather boots. They had actively plotted to lock me away in a state-run nursing home to steal my modest historic property. Now they were forced to confront the devastating reality that the man they treated like absolute garbage was the financial god who held their entire existence in the palm of his hand. Their pristine suburban facade was entirely dead, and they were drowning in the brutal ashes of their own staggering ignorance. Terrence was still sobbing heavily into the phone, begging for an explanation, pleading for some kind of magical reassurance that his life was not completely over. "Dad, please say something," he wept, his voice completely devoid of any dignity. "Please tell me you are going to fix this. Tell me you are not the one sending the federal auditors into my department. Tell me you are not going to let them put me in a federal prison cell. We are family, Dad. You have to save us." I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute icy calm settle permanently into my veins. I looked back at the television screen where my broadcasted image was currently discussing the ruthless nature of corporate betrayal and the necessity of absolute accountability. I brought the phone closer to my mouth and spoke with a chilling, unforgiving finality that left absolutely no room for negotiation. "Merry Christmas, Terrence." I said, my voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth or mercy. "You wanted a sophisticated, affluent life completely separate from your troublesome old father, and I am simply giving you exactly what you asked for." The sobbing on the other end of the line hitched completely as the absolute finality of my words struck him. "Do not turn off the television, son," I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal frozen whisper. "You need to keep watching the broadcast very closely. My special holiday gift to you and your beautiful, entitled wife is not quite over yet." I pulled the encrypted phone away from my ear, ignoring his final desperate screaming wail, and pressed the red button to sever the connection entirely. I placed the device face down on my mahogany desk and picked up my heavy crystal glass of vintage bourbon. I leaned back in my leather armchair, taking a slow, satisfying sip, as the Fox News anchor turned the televised interview toward the topic of corporate restructuring. The true public execution was about to begin. The television anchor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished glass desk. "Mr. Hayes," the anchor asked, his voice hushed with intense journalistic anticipation. "With your sudden public emergence, what exactly is the future trajectory of Apex Holdings?" I adjusted my posture, sitting perfectly straight in the plush studio chair. "The future of my massive corporation relies entirely on absolute transparency and a zero-tolerance policy for internal corruption," I stated, looking directly into the primary camera lens. I wanted my dark eyes to pierce through the national broadcast and stare directly into my son and his living room. Effective immediately, we are initiating a comprehensive restructuring of our logistics subsidiary. We recently uncovered a highly sophisticated embezzlement scheme operating within the upper management of that specific division. I paused, letting the immense gravity of the moment build across the silent airwaves. "Therefore, I am using this unprecedented public platform to announce the immediate termination of the regional director, Terrence Hayes." I said his full name with absolute clinical detachment. "He has been officially fired for gross misconduct and the active premeditated embezzlement of $200,000 in corporate funds. He is no longer affiliated with Apex Holdings in any capacity." My executive legal team has already compiled the undeniable forensic evidence, and we have formally surrendered the entire comprehensive dossier to federal law enforcement authorities for immediate criminal prosecution. I made sure to emphasize that corporate thieves would find absolutely no shelter within my empire, regardless of their personal connections or familial ties. I systematically stripped Terrence of his prestigious job, his unearned income, and his entire professional reputation in less than 60 seconds. He was now a publicly branded corporate felon. The stunned news anchor attempted to interject to ask a follow-up question about the shocking live termination, but I raised my hand slightly, demanding absolute silence. I was not finished completely cleansing my corporate palate. Furthermore, I continued, my voice resonating with lethal authority across the national broadcast. Apex Holdings relies heavily on the absolute integrity of our external commercial partners. We are currently preparing to break ground on the multi-billion-dollar waterfront redevelopment project. It has come to my direct executive attention that one of the primary bidding contractors operates with severe financial instability and an utter lack of basic ethical standards. I looked directly into the camera lens once again, knowing Richard Montgomery was watching his pathetic empire crumble in real time. Effective immediately, Apex Holdings is permanently severing all ties, withdrawing all pending bids, and completely blacklisting Montgomery Construction. I named his fragile company with deliberate, ruthless precision. We have uncovered highly predatory business practices and catastrophic liquidity issues within their organizational structure. Richard Montgomery and his failing construction firm will never secure a single contract from my corporation or any of our affiliated financial subsidiaries. We absolutely refuse to do business with individuals who display such a profound lack of basic human decency and professional solvency. The execution was completely flawless. I had just publicly warned every single major bank, commercial developer, and private investor on the Eastern Seaboard that Richard Montgomery was financially toxic and ethically bankrupt. No legitimate financial institution would ever lend him another dime. No reputable developer would ever return his frantic phone calls. I had systematically welded every single door shut and burned his entire professional legacy straight to the ground. He thought he was dealing with an ignorant retired carpenter he could easily bully into submission. Instead, he had unknowingly provoked a corporate titan who possessed the exact raw power to permanently erase his entire arrogant existence from the commercial map. Sitting in the quiet darkness of my Brooklyn study, I took another slow, satisfying sip of my vintage bourbon and visualized the exact chaotic fallout currently detonating across their pristine suburban neighborhood. Courtney had built her entire pathetic identity upon a highly fragile illusion of inherited wealth and unearned social superiority. She desperately craved the validation of the elite country club housewives and the wealthy suburban socialites. She had explicitly banished me from her Thanksgiving table and revoked my Christmas invitation specifically to protect that artificial aristocratic facade. Now that very facade was violently shattering into a million irreparable pieces. I knew exactly how the vicious upper crust of society operated. They despise absolutely nothing more than the foul stench of public financial scandal and looming federal criminal investigations. The exact second my televised broadcast concluded, the relentless group chats of her wealthy fake friends would ignite with vicious, toxic gossip. Courtney would suddenly find herself entirely excommunicated from the very elite circles she sacrificed her own basic humanity to join. Her phone, which usually buzzed with exclusive holiday party invitations and expensive brunch dates, would go completely and permanently dead. If she dared to show her face at the local luxury boutiques or the private country club dining room, the management would quietly and firmly ask her to leave to avoid disturbing the legitimate, affluent members. She was no longer the sophisticated wife of a rising corporate star and the proud daughter of a wealthy commercial developer. She was instantly reduced to the disgraced wife of a publicly terminated, soon-to-be imprisoned felon and the spoiled daughter of a heavily blacklisted bankrupt fraud. The absolute sheer magnitude of her sudden social isolation would crush her fragile ego completely. The very people she tried so desperately to impress by humiliating a hard-working black man were now aggressively locking their wrought iron gates against her. She was entirely destitute, trapped in a rapidly collapsing house of cards with absolutely zero allies remaining. The exclusive television broadcast finally concluded, fading back into standard financial commentary. I pressed the power button on the television remote and the massive screen went completely black, plunging my quiet study back into peaceful, comfortable silence. I finished the last warm drop of my expensive bourbon, placed the heavy crystal glass on the polished mahogany desk, and walked slowly upstairs to my bedroom. I lay down on my firm mattress, pulled the heavy blankets over my chest, and closed my eyes. It was the most profound, completely undisturbed rest I had experienced in years. The heavy burden of a deeply ungrateful son had been entirely lifted from my aging shoulders. I woke up the next morning feeling entirely rejuvenated. It was December 25th, Christmas morning. I walked downstairs and looked out the large front window. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a pristine, untouched white blanket over the quiet, historic streets of Brooklyn. The world looked incredibly peaceful and entirely clean, but the absolute tranquility of the holiday morning was violently shattered precisely at 8 o'clock. A loud, frantic, and highly aggressive pounding echoed heavily through the thick walls of my brownstone. Someone was slamming their fists repeatedly against my heavy oak front door. The heavy brass knocker was being struck with sheer animalistic desperation. It was not the polite, cheerful knock of holiday visitors or friendly neighborhood carolers. It was the chaotic, disorganized thrashing of terrified rats who had finally realized they were completely backed into an inescapable corner. The desperate banging continued, growing louder and more frantic with every passing second. I did not rush. I walked slowly up the stairs and dressed myself impeccably in a crisp, clean shirt and a sharp-tailored blazer. I checked my reflection in the mirror, smoothing my collar with calm, deliberate precision. The ultimate reckoning had officially arrived on my front doorstep, and I was fully prepared to open the door. I walked down the heavy wooden staircase, taking my absolute time as the frantic pounding against my front door threatened to completely splinter the aged, historic oak. I reached the entryway and unlocked the heavy iron deadbolt, pulling the massive door open to the freezing Christmas morning air. Terrence Courtney and Richard Montgomery stood huddled together on my pristine, snowy porch, looking like completely deranged vagrants. Their expensive winter coats were thrown on haphazardly, and their pale faces were visibly twisted into grotesque masks of sheer absolute panic. Terrence had his bare fist raised, prepared to violently strike the brass knocker again, but he froze completely midair. They fully expected to find the lonely, vulnerable old carpenter they had so viciously mocked just weeks prior. They aggressively expected to barge into my private home and verbally bully me into a desperate submission. Instead, their terrified eyes widened dramatically as they looked past my tailored blazer and saw exactly what was patiently waiting for them inside my expansive foyer. I was not standing alone in my historic brownstone. Jonathan Reed, my ruthless chief legal counsel, stood perfectly straight directly behind my right shoulder, holding a thick black leather briefcase. Flanking Jonathan were two massive private security contractors dressed in immaculate dark suits with discreet communication earpieces resting tightly against their muscular necks. These were not standard local neighborhood watchmen. They were highly trained former military operatives employed specifically by the elite executive protection branch of Apex Holdings. The sheer overwhelming physical intimidation of the defensive human wall I had strategically constructed instantly neutralized any aggressive physical threat Richard or Terrence might have foolishly planned. I stared intensely at the three shivering intruders standing on my frozen front porch. My facial expression was entirely devoid of any festive holiday cheer or residual paternal warmth. "State your absolute business," I commanded, my voice slicing through the biting winter wind like a freshly sharpened steel blade. "You have exactly 10 seconds to speak before my security team physically removes you from my private property." All the toxic, unearned arrogance that had practically radiated from Courtney during that infamous Thanksgiving dinner completely evaporated into the freezing morning air. The vibrant, healthy color drained entirely from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking as pale and brittle as shattered porcelain. Her heavily manicured hands shook violently at her sides, and she took a profound, subconscious step backward, terrified by the sheer immense power radiating from my illuminated hallway. Terrence did not retreat. My son, the formerly prestigious corporate director, completely collapsed under the crushing psychological weight of his own criminal actions. His legs gave out entirely, and he dropped heavily onto the snowy concrete of my front porch. He fell directly to his knees, completely ruining the expensive fabric of his tailored trousers in the freezing gray slush. He crawled forward frantically, wrapping his trembling hands around the polished leather of my expensive Italian shoes. "Dad," he wailed, his voice completely breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched, desperate sob. "Dad, please, I am actively begging you. You cannot do this to me. You cannot send me to a federal prison. I will lose absolutely everything. The federal authorities called my personal cell phone this morning. They are freezing all my domestic banking accounts. You have to call your legal team off right now. You have to tell the corporate board it was all a terrible financial misunderstanding. I will pay back every single cent I stole, I swear to God. Just please drop the active embezzlement charges. I will immediately divorce Courtney. I will legally separate myself from her greedy family. I will do whatever you demand. I am your only biological son. You cannot let them lock me in a concrete cage." He was openly weeping, hot, desperate tears streaming down his face and dripping directly onto my pristine footwear. It was a pathetic, profoundly humiliating display of absolute human cowardice. He was completely willing to instantly throw his entitled wife directly under the speeding bus just to save his own miserable skin from the federal prosecutors. I looked down at the sobbing, broken man clinging desperately to my shoes. I actively searched deep within my own soul for even a single microscopic shred of lingering paternal sympathy. I meticulously looked for the fierce protective instinct that had previously driven me to break my own physical bones working double shifts just to properly fund his elite education. I found absolutely nothing but empty space. The deep well of fatherly devotion had been completely poisoned and permanently sealed off by his own treacherous actions. My gaze was no longer the soft, forgiving look of a loving parent. It was the absolute cold, calculating stare of a ruthless capitalist examining a highly defective and toxic financial asset. Any pathetic attempt to invoke the sacred bond of family was completely ridiculous now. Terrence and his manipulative wife had explicitly redefined our relationship the exact moment they actively conspired to steal my property and lock me away in a state medical facility. They had permanently stripped away the protective armor of familial love and deliberately replaced it with the brutal, unforgiving rules of corporate warfare. In the harsh, unforgiving realm of high-stakes corporate finance, you do not forgive active internal embezzlement because the thief happens to share your biological DNA. You completely eradicate the internal threat to protect the absolute financial integrity of the massive empire. You made a highly calculated professional decision to intentionally defraud my holding company, Terrence, I stated calmly, looking down at him with zero emotional attachment. You utilized my own corporate infrastructure to finance a fraudulent aristocratic lifestyle for a woman who viewed my black skin and working-class hands as a literal social disease. You actively traded your personal integrity for cheap suburban validation. Apex Holdings does not negotiate with verified corporate thieves. The federal embezzlement charges will absolutely not be dropped or reduced. You will completely face the maximum judicial penalties for your extreme financial crimes. I gently but firmly kicked my foot backward, physically dislodging his trembling hands from my leather shoes. Richard Montgomery finally stepped forward, aggressively pushing his sobbing son-in-law aside with his heavy winter boot. The bankrupt commercial developer actively attempted to muster whatever pathetic shreds of corporate authority he believed he still possessed. He aggressively cleared his throat, trying to project the false, unwavering confidence of a seasoned boardroom negotiator. Harrison. He began utilizing a completely fake tone of business professionalism. Let us act like rational, intelligent businessmen here. We both know that highly publicized federal financial scandals negatively impact massive corporate portfolios. We can certainly find a mutually beneficial financial arrangement to quietly resolve this unfortunate family misunderstanding without aggressively involving the destructive federal authorities. My construction firm still possesses valuable hard assets. We can actively leverage my heavy commercial equipment to fully reimburse your logistics division. There is absolutely no need to completely destroy our respective legacies over a temporary lapse in my son-in-law and his overall judgment. I stared at the desperate, arrogant fool standing on my porch. He actually believed he still held viable cards to play at my executive table. He truly thought he could negotiate his way out of a federal crime scene. I gestured sharply to Jonathan Reed. My ruthless attorney stepped forward smoothly, bypassing the kneeling Terrence. We walked back into my spacious living room, and the three terrified intruders eagerly followed, completely desperate for any perceived lifeline. We stopped at the massive glass coffee table sitting in the center of the room. Jonathan opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, thickly bound dossier. He slammed the heavy file down onto the pristine glass surface with a violent crashing sound that made Courtney physically jump backward. "Negotiate," I asked, my voice echoing with a dark, highly lethal amusement. "You genuinely believe you possess the necessary leverage to actively negotiate with the chairman of Apex Holdings?" I pointed a single steady finger at the heavy black folder resting on the glass table. "Before you attempt to broker a pathetic business deal, Richard, you need to look at exactly what is waiting for you inside that specific folder." Jonathan Reed stepped forward and casually flipped open the heavy cover of the black dossier. He did not speak with anger or malice. He spoke with the terrifying mechanical precision of a corporate executioner reading a list of fatal charges. He pulled out the first stack of transcribed documents and glossy photographs, laying them flat against the pristine glass for the three intruders to see. "Here is the complete audio transcript and the digital sound file from Thanksgiving night," Jonathan stated smoothly. "It clearly details your explicit conspiracy to force a perfectly healthy man into a state-run medical facility to steal his primary residence." Courtney let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as she recognized her own vicious words printed in stark black ink. Terrence stared at the paper, looking as if he was going to be physically sick right there on the floor. Jonathan did not pause his relentless assault. He produced a sleek digital tablet and tapped the screen. The high-definition video captured by the micro camera hidden in my flannel shirt began playing loudly. Courtney was displayed in crystal-clear resolution, aggressively threatening to file incompetency papers if I did not surrender my historic home. Next, Jonathan withdrew a thick stack of financial records. "Here are the 5 fraudulent credit card statements opened using my client's stolen identity, complete with the unauthorized spending logs and the digital footprints linking directly back to your personal laptop, Courtney." Finally, Jonathan placed a certified digital hard drive on top of the towering pile, and this contains the unedited security footage from Dr. Richard Vance and his private clinic, documenting your blatant cash bribe to secure a forged medical diagnosis of severe cognitive decline. You are all currently staring at a mountain of undeniable, irrefutable evidence that carries a combined maximum sentence of over 30 years in federal prison. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. They were completely surrounded, trapped by their own relentless, inescapable greed. The artificial bonds of their pretentious aristocratic alliance violently shattered the exact second the sheer reality of the federal prison sentences registered in their minds. There is absolutely no loyalty among exposed criminals when the heavy steel doors begin to close. Courtney spun around, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, and delivered a vicious, open-handed slap directly across Terrence and his tear-stained cheek. The sharp crack of her hand striking his flesh echoed loudly through my spacious living room, causing the private security guards to tense slightly. "You absolutely useless, pathetic excuse for a man," she shrieked, her eyes darting around the room in absolute panic. Her voice was completely devoid of the refined country club accent she usually faked. "You promised me we were completely safe. You promised me your father was just a stupid, ignorant carpenter who would never figure it out. You could not even steal money correctly. You dragged me into a federal crime scene because you are a weak, incompetent failure. Terrence recoiled, holding his bright red cheek, but before he could even attempt to formulate a pathetic defense, Richard Montgomery exploded in a fit of violent, aggressive rage. The bankrupt commercial developer lunged forward, grabbing Terrence violently by the lapels of his expensive winter coat. "You dragged my entire pristine legacy into the filthy mud, you stupid, arrogant boy," Richard roared, spittle flying from his lips as he aggressively shook his son-in-law. "My entire construction firm is dead. I am facing total liquidation and active federal investigations because you and your greedy wife decided to play amateur mobsters." Richard violently shoved Terrence backward, sending him crashing heavily into an antique armchair. "I am entirely done with both of you," Richard spat, pointing a shaking, furious finger at his own daughter. "You are completely on your own, Courtney. I am calling my own legal counsel, and I am aggressively cooperating with the federal authorities. I will gladly testify against both of you to save myself from dying in a concrete cell." They were viciously tearing each other to shreds, completely turning on their own flesh and blood. I stood perfectly still with my arms crossed tightly over my chest, watching the spectacular destruction of their fragile, toxic alliance unfold right in my own living room. I did not intervene to stop the screaming or the physical violence. I simply watched them with the cold, detached fascination of a scientist observing a highly predictable chemical reaction. Their entire relationship, their entire fabricated family structure was exclusively glued together by the promise of stolen luxury and unearned status. Money was their absolute ultimate god, and the sudden catastrophic absence of that money was the fatal poison currently dissolving their souls. I thought about my late wife Camille and the incredible life we built together from absolute scratch within the walls of this very house. We endured years of profound poverty, eating cheap meals and living in freezing apartments, but we never once turned on each other. Our bond was forged in the fire of genuine mutual respect and unwavering, unbreakable loyalty. We possessed actual character. The three terrified individuals currently screaming and crying in my living room possessed absolutely nothing but empty designer labels and staggering moral bankruptcy. Terrence had casually thrown away the unconditional love of a father who would have gladly died for him simply to impress a woman who was now actively slapping him in the face and calling him a pathetic failure. Courtney had aggressively traded her basic human decency for a lifestyle she could not afford, and was now being violently disowned by her own bankrupt father. They were learning the hardest lesson the universe has to offer. When you build your entire life on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and aggressive greed, the eventual structural collapse is absolutely devastating. I felt absolutely zero pity for any of them. The brutal suffering they were currently experiencing was entirely self-inflicted. I was merely holding up a high-definition mirror and forcing them to finally look at the hideous monsters they had willingly become to chase a dollar. The vicious screaming match was rapidly escalating into a full-blown physical altercation when Jonathan Reed decided to abruptly end the pathetic theatrical display. The ruthless corporate attorney loudly cleared his throat, a sharp, commanding sound that instantly pierced through the chaotic shouting. Terrence, Courtney, and Richard froze completely, turning their panicked eyes back to the man holding the power to destroy their entire existence. The criminal evidence regarding the extortion and the medical fraud has already been aggressively dispatched to the proper federal authorities, Jonathan stated in a smooth, icy tone that demanded absolute attention. That specific legal process is completely out of your hands now, and you will be contacted by law enforcement very soon. However, there is one final piece of administrative business we must formally conclude this morning. Jonathan reached a highly manicured hand deep into his black leather briefcase. He bypassed the thick folders of criminal evidence and pulled out a single crisp piece of brightly colored paper. It was a stark, vibrant shade of pink that immediately caught the ambient light of the room, representing the ultimate loss of their suburban sanctuary. He stepped forward and shoved the pink paper directly into Courtney and her trembling hands. "That is a formal legal eviction notice," Jonathan declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. As previously stated during the national television broadcast, Apex Holdings successfully purchased the entire massive debt portfolio attached to your suburban property. Due to your severe financial delinquency and the active federal fraud investigations regarding your income statements, the holding company has officially foreclosed on the primary mortgage. You do not own that house. You do not possess any equity in that house. You are currently trespassing on corporate property. You and your husband have exactly 48 hours to remove your personal belongings and permanently vacate the premises before the local sheriff's department forcefully removes you. The final devastating blow had been struck, completely crippling them and sealing their absolute ruin. Jonathan Reed did not merely hand over the pink eviction notice, he weaponized it. He stood tall in the center of my living room and explained the exact legal mechanics of their absolute ruin with the cold precision of a ticking metronome. As previously stated, he began pointing at the trembling paper in Courtney and her hands. Apex Holdings systematically purchased your entire massive debt portfolio from your regional bank. You financed a $3 million property using heavily falsified income statements and incredibly leveraged credit lines. When the federal investigators officially flagged your financial profile for severe identity theft and massive wire fraud, it triggered an immediate default clause hidden deep within the fine print of your original mortgage agreement. The holding company legally executed a rapid foreclosure protocol late last night. You are entirely stripped of all equity. The bank does not own your pristine suburban mansion anymore. Harrison Hayes owns it completely and absolutely. Because of the active criminal fraud attached to your original loan application, standard eviction grace periods are entirely null and void. You do not get 30 days to pack your expensive designer bags. You do not get to hold a dignified moving sale to save face with your wealthy neighbors. You are currently legally trespassing on private corporate property. My firm has already filed the appropriate injunctions with the local municipal court. If you or your disgraced husband attempt to remove any valuable fixtures or cause any physical damage to the property before your immediate departure, we will aggressively add destruction of corporate assets to your rapidly growing list of federal charges. You have absolutely nothing left to your name. Every single brick of that house belongs exclusively to the man standing right in front of you. Courtney stared blankly at the bright pink paper resting in her trembling palms. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug into the cheap paper, violently crinkling the edges. The sheer magnitude of her complete social and financial destruction finally broke through her thick layers of unearned arrogance. She opened her mouth and let out a guttural, agonizing scream of absolute despair. It was the horrific sound of a vain, materialistic woman realizing her entire superficial identity had been completely erased from existence. She possessed absolutely no house to return to. She possessed absolutely no pristine reputation to leverage in the wealthy suburbs. She possessed absolutely no hidden financial assets to cushion her massive, catastrophic fall. Her wealthy country club friends had completely abandoned her. Her bankrupt father had violently disowned her right in my living room. Her criminal husband was currently kneeling in a puddle of melted snow, and his own pathetic tears entirely useless and completely broken. She dropped to her knees right next to Terrence, clutching the bright pink eviction notice to her chest and sobbing uncontrollably into the expensive fabric of her winter coat. I did not feel a single ounce of pity watching her dramatic collapse. I slowly stepped forward, my polished Italian leather shoes coming to a complete stop just inches away from where she kneeled on my hardwood floor. I looked down at her completely ruined face. Her expensive makeup was heavily smeared, running down her pale cheeks in thick, dark streams. She looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of all the fake aristocratic armor she used to brutalize working-class people. I leaned down slightly, ensuring my voice would cut directly through her hysterical sobbing. I want you to remember exactly what you boldly told me on Thanksgiving night, Courtney. I stated, my tone echoing with a lethal frozen calm. You stood in the dining room of a house I am now actively kicking you out of, and you looked me dead in the eye. You told me I was ruining your holiday. You explicitly instructed me not to bother coming to your Christmas dinner. You confidently declared that I was just a troublesome old black man who completely embarrassed your pristine family. I continued, letting the heavy words hang in the freezing air of the living room. You fiercely believed that your fragile artificial status made you infinitely superior to the man who funded your entire existence in secret. You thought my calloused hands and my faded flannel shirts made me weak, ignorant, and easily disposable. I watched her squeeze her eyes shut completely, unable to meet my intense, unyielding gaze. I want you to look at me right now. Courtney, I commanded, my voice cracking like a heavy leather whip. She flinched violently but slowly raised her tear-stained face to look up at me. You were absolutely right, I whispered, staring directly into her terrified blue eyes. I am a very troublesome old man. I am incredibly troublesome to ungrateful parasites who mistake my profound patience for pathetic weakness. I am fiercely troublesome to entitled opportunists who actively attempt to steal my historic home and lock me inside a state medical facility. And that highly troublesome nature you despised so much just officially made you entirely homeless, right in the middle of a freezing New York winter. I straightened my posture, towering over both of them like a monolithic statue of absolute judgment. You threw me out into the bitter cold on Thanksgiving simply because my modest clothing offended your delicate suburban sensibilities. Now I am deliberately throwing you out into the heavy December snow because your profound moral corruption absolutely offends my basic human decency. You will drag your designer suitcases through the freezing slush, and you will quickly realize that the ruthless winter wind does not care about your precious country club membership. You are going to learn exactly how incredibly cold the real world is when you do not have a working-class man quietly paying for your artificial warmth. You completely brought this massive, devastating blizzard directly upon yourselves. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the spacious room, broken only by the pathetic, ragged breathing of my disgraced son and his entirely ruined wife. Richard Montgomery stood completely frozen in the corner of the room, staring at me with a profound, terrified realization that he had actively provoked a financial monster he could never hope to defeat. He silently calculated his own impending doom, knowing his bankrupt construction firm was the very next target on my execution list. But the absolute final act of my Christmas morning reckoning had not yet fully arrived. Through the thick, insulated windows of my historic brownstone, a high-pitched wailing sound began to pierce the quiet holiday morning. The sharp, aggressive shriek of police sirens echoed loudly down the empty Brooklyn streets, rapidly growing closer and significantly louder with every passing second. Terrence snapped his head toward the front window, his tear-filled eyes widening in fresh, unadulterated panic. Courtney scrambled backward across the hardwood floor, pressing her spine hard against the base of my antique sofa. The flashing red and blue emergency lights violently illuminated the pristine white snow resting on my front porch, casting chaotic, colorful shadows across the walls of my living room. "They are here." Terrence choked out his voice, shaking so violently he could barely articulate the terrifying words. "The police are actually here." I did not turn to look at the approaching patrol vehicles. I kept my dark eyes firmly locked on my sobbing son. "Those are not standard neighborhood patrols responding to a minor residential noise complaint, Terrence," I stated calmly, buttoning the front of my tailored blazer. "My chief legal counsel filed a comprehensive criminal report with the federal and local authorities exactly 1 hour ago, detailing your massive corporate embezzlement and your active, desperate attempts to flee international borders. You are not just facing an aggressive financial foreclosure today. Your ultimate punishment has finally arrived right at my front door." The heavy oak door swung completely open, pushed by the gloved hands of 4 uniformed police officers. They did not wait for an invitation to cross my threshold. They moved with swift, tactical precision, flanking my security team and zeroing in directly on the man kneeling on my floor. Terrence Hayes, the lead officer, barked, his voice booming with unmistakable state authority. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, felony identity theft, and massive corporate embezzlement." Terrence did not even attempt to run or fight back. He simply went entirely limp, sobbing loudly as 2 officers grabbed him by his custom-tailored lapels and hauled him roughly to his feet. The sharp metallic clink of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed clearly through the room. It was the absolute, final, undeniable sound of his total defeat. They patted him down, roughly stripping away his expensive designer watch and the electronic key fob to his leased luxury vehicle. Courtney shrieked, clutching her face as the officers loudly read him his Miranda rights, detailing the exact federal crimes my legal team had meticulously documented. Richard stood frozen, completely powerless to intervene against the overwhelming force of federal and local law enforcement taking down his fraudulent son-in-law. Terrence looked back at me over his shoulder as they began to march him toward the exit. His eyes were wide with a pathetic, desperate plea for a last-minute rescue that he knew was never going to come. I did not blink. I offered absolutely no parental comfort or promise of legal aid. "You made your own bed, Terrence," I stated coldly over the chaotic noise of the arrest. "Now you will sleep in a concrete cell." They shoved him out the front door and into the biting winter cold. I stepped out onto my front porch to watch the completion of his absolute public humiliation. The flashing emergency lights had predictably drawn the attention of my wealthy Brooklyn neighbors. Doors opened up and down the historic street, and curious onlookers stepped out onto their snowy stoops, wrapping their thick robes tightly around themselves to witness the spectacle. They watched in stunned silence as the formerly arrogant corporate director was aggressively shoved into the cramped back seat of a marked police cruiser. Terrence hung his head, trying desperately to hide his tear-stained face from the very people he used to aggressively boast to about his fictional promotions. Courtney stumbled out of my house completely shell-shocked. She tripped over the elevated threshold of the door frame, and her wildly expensive designer handbag slipped from her trembling fingers, landing face down in a filthy puddle of gray slush. She did not even bother to retrieve it. She stood shivering uncontrollably in the freezing snow, watching the police car doors slam shut on her husband. She let out a dry, hollow gasp as the police cruiser finally pulled away from the curb, taking her primary source of stolen income straight to the central booking station. In a desperate final bid for a lifeline, she pulled her smartphone from her pocket and frantically began dialing numbers. I stood silently on the porch, watching her repeatedly raise the phone to her ear, only to aggressively lower it in mounting sheer panic. She was calling the elite country club housewives she had spent years aggressively courting. She was dialing the numbers of the wealthy suburban socialites who had attended her lavish dinner parties. Not a single person answered her frantic calls. The national television broadcast had done its job flawlessly. She was now officially a toxic social pariah. Everyone she knew had completely blocked her number, desperate to avoid the massive radioactive fallout of a high-profile federal crime syndicate. She was completely isolated, standing in the freezing snow with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and the horrifying realization that her artificial life was permanently over. I looked down at the shivering, ruined woman from the elevated vantage point of my historic stone steps. The brutal contrast between our current realities was a staggering testament to the absolute power of silent discipline. Just 1 month ago, this exact same woman had stood at the head of a pristine Thanksgiving table and viciously belittled my existence. She had looked at my dark skin, my calloused working-class hands, and my simple clothing, and wrongly concluded that I was an ignorant parasite completely unworthy of her refined company. She had actively conspired to lock me inside a sterile state-funded medical ward simply to steal the very property she was currently standing in front of. Now the cosmic scales of justice had been aggressively and permanently balanced. The old black man she considered a bothersome burden was standing tall, wrapped in a custom-tailored suit, holding the indisputable legal authority over her entire ruined universe. I had not needed to raise my voice or throw a single physical punch to destroy her. I merely wielded the massive financial empire I had spent 40 grueling years building from absolute scratch, alongside a woman who actually understood the true value of loyalty. Camille and I had endured relentless racial prejudice and severe economic hardships to secure this specific piece of Brooklyn real estate. We had scrubbed floors and denied ourselves every single luxury so our ungrateful son could eventually mock our sacrifices to appease his shallow wife. Standing on that snowy porch, I felt an overwhelming surge of profound vindication. I was no longer the silent, accommodating father willing to absorb their toxic abuse to keep the fragile peace. I was Harrison Hayes, the undisputed titan of Apex Holdings, and I had successfully reclaimed every single ounce of the dignity they had attempted to aggressively strip away from me. Their absolute downfall was not a mere stroke of bad luck, but a meticulously crafted execution, orchestrated by the very man they had foolishly discarded. They were learning that true power never begs for respect. The immediate arrests and the sudden traumatic evictions were only the opening salvos in a much larger and far more devastating war. Barely 3 days after that chaotic Christmas morning, the federal and state authorities made their next aggressive move. Based entirely on the comprehensive financial dossiers Jonathan Reed had aggressively forwarded to the investigative agencies, a massive asset freeze order was officially executed against Montgomery Construction. Richard Montgomery woke up to find heavily armed federal agents actively raiding his commercial offices and seizing every single piece of heavy machinery he owned to satisfy his massive fraudulent debts. The banks immediately foreclosed on his personal properties, leaving him and his equally arrogant wife completely out on the street. Courtney, who had desperately fled to her parents' house after being forcefully removed from my property, suddenly found herself entirely homeless for the second time in less than a week. The mighty Montgomery family, the arrogant suburban royalty who had looked down their noses at my entire existence, was officially reduced to seeking emergency shelter in incredibly cheap roadside motels. They were completely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their freedom. They were drowning in massive legal fees they could not possibly afford, and public disgrace they could never outrun. I sat in my warm study reading the breaking news reports detailing their spectacular commercial collapse with a profound sense of icy satisfaction. But I knew the ultimate reckoning was not yet complete. The financial ruin and the total social exile were merely the necessary preparations for the final brutal stage of their absolute destruction. Terrence was sitting in a freezing holding cell, desperately awaiting a bail hearing he could never afford, and Richard was facing massive corporate indictments. The grand finale of their complete annihilation was rapidly approaching. The merciless legal punishment orchestrated by the American judicial system had only just officially begun. Exactly 1 month after that freezing Christmas morning, the final remnants of their artificial empire officially crumbled into fine dust. Richard Montgomery formally filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, effectively surrendering the last pathetic scraps of his commercial legacy to the federal courts. His heavy construction equipment was aggressively auctioned off for pennies on the dollar to his biggest corporate rivals, and his pristine suburban estate was immediately seized by aggressive corporate creditors. He went from a boastful commercial developer to a completely broken man living on meager government assistance in a matter of a few short weeks. Courtney, displaying the absolute predictable loyalty of a starving rat trapped on a rapidly sinking ship, immediately filed for a highly contested divorce. Terrence was still sitting in a freezing county holding cell awaiting his official federal trial when his appointed public defender handed him the divorce papers. Courtney desperately attempted to salvage whatever hidden financial assets she falsely believed still existed, fighting tooth and nail to secure spousal alimony from a man who was entirely destitute. The presiding family court judge quickly threw her pathetic demands completely out of the courtroom. Terrence possessed absolutely zero equity, zero savings, and massive federal restitution debts. By legally severing her marriage ties, Courtney officially secured absolutely nothing but her own profound isolation. She walked out of that family courthouse entirely empty-handed, stripped of her stolen last name and completely devoid of her unearned suburban wealth. The iron-tight prenuptial agreement Jonathan Reed had quietly engineered for Terrence years ago, back when I still foolishly wanted to protect my son, guaranteed that Courtney would leave the marriage with exactly what she brought into it, which was absolutely nothing. She was completely severed from the Hayes family fortune, forever facing a cold, brutal reality with no financial parachute to break her massive, catastrophic fall. The absolute severity of Courtney and her catastrophic social and financial freefall was a brutal testament to the harsh reality of the working-class world she had so violently despised. Deprived of her luxury vehicles, her massive fraudulent credit lines, and her wealthy social circle, she was aggressively forced into a life of desperate, grueling survival. The former country club socialite was violently evicted from her parents' cramped temporary apartment after a massive screaming match regarding her profound selfishness. With absolutely zero marketable job skills and a heavily tarnished public reputation, permanently linked to a massive federal fraud syndicate, she was entirely unemployable in any reputable corporate sector. She was eventually forced to rent a tiny damp room in a severely dilapidated boarding house located on the absolute grimiest outskirts of the city. The peeling wallpaper and the constantly leaking pipes were a stark, agonizing daily reminder of the pristine suburban mansion she had foolishly thrown away out of sheer, unadulterated greed. To pay her meager weekly rent, Courtney was aggressively forced to accept a grueling minimum wage position working for a commercial sanitation company. The woman who had openly mocked my calloused hands and my faded work clothes was now spending 10 agonizing hours a day aggressively scrubbing industrial toilets and emptying heavy trash receptacles in the very corporate office buildings she used to proudly shop in. She wore a heavily stained gray polyester uniform, completely replacing her expensive designer dresses. Her perfectly manicured fingernails chipped and cracked under the harsh, toxic chemicals of industrial bleach. Every single door to high society was violently slammed shut directly in her exhausted face. When she desperately attempted to reach out to her former elite friends begging for small personal loans or simple administrative jobs, she was met with absolute brutal silence. She was a total social ghost, completely trapped in a grueling physical hell of her own deliberate creation. She was finally experiencing the exact bitter taste of the working-class life she had so casually treated like a disgusting infectious disease. Her arrogant pride had been entirely eradicated. While Courtney was actively scrubbing floors, I decided to pay a highly calculated visit to the county detention center. I sat perfectly still in the sterile visiting room, staring through the thick, reinforced plexiglass, waiting for the guards to bring out the inmate. The heavy metal door opened and Terrence shuffled into the small cubicle. The physical transformation was absolutely shocking. The confident, polished executive had been completely erased. Terrence was severely gaunt, his cheekbones jutting out sharply against his pale, sickly skin. His bright orange prison jumpsuit hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and his hands trembled violently as he picked up the heavy black plastic telephone receiver. I picked up my respective receiver and maintained a stare of absolute freezing stone. "Dad," he rasped, his voice a hollow, pathetic echo of its former strength. "Are you finally here to help me? Are you bringing your lawyers to get me out of this concrete hell?" I did not blink. I did not offer a single ounce of paternal warmth. "I am solely here to look at the final catastrophic result of your profound arrogance, Terrence," I stated calmly, my voice completely devoid of any emotional fluctuation. His desperate eyes instantly hardened, filling with a toxic, bitter rage. "You are an absolute monster," he spat furiously, gripping the plastic receiver so tightly his white knuckles shook. "You completely destroyed my life. You let Courtney walk away and you threw your own biological son to the federal wolves. You are entirely cold-blooded. You have absolutely no heart." I let his pathetic, childish accusations wash over me, completely undisturbed by his transparent attempt at emotional manipulation. I slowly leaned closer to the reinforced glass, ensuring my voice would pierce directly into his soul. "You made a highly calculated adult decision to choose money over family, Terrence." I whispered, my tone sharp and lethal. "You actively worshipped the illusion of wealth and treated my unconditional love like a disposable burden. I am not cold-blooded. I am simply the ultimate reflection of your own disgusting greed. I just showed you the true unforgiving power of the very thing you aggressively chose to worship." I hung up the heavy black receiver, completely cutting off his frantic screaming before he could utter another pathetic, desperate excuse. I stood up from the metal chair, smoothed the crisp lapels of my tailored blazer, and walked out of the bleak detention center without ever looking back. The absolute final remnants of my fatherly obligation had been entirely permanently severed inside that sterile visiting room. There was absolutely nothing left to discuss, and absolutely nothing left to salvage. The long, agonizing months of pre-trial motions and frantic legal maneuvering by his overworked public defender finally expired. The highly anticipated day of the federal trial had officially arrived, bringing the ultimate climax to this massive corporate and familial betrayal. I stepped out of my black town car and walked up the massive stone steps of the federal courthouse, my heavy Italian leather shoes clicking with absolute authority against the pavement. Inside the grand oak-paneled courtroom, the designated jury was already seated, looking intensely serious and fully prepared to deliver absolute legal justice. Jonathan Reed sat calmly at the prosecution table, having aggressively coordinated every single piece of undeniable evidence with the federal attorneys. Terrence was led into the courtroom wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit, looking like a completely broken, terrified animal facing the absolute end of his existence. The sheer magnitude of the ironclad evidence waiting to be presented, the pristine audio recordings, the forged digital signatures, the compromised medical bribes, and the explicit financial wire transfers, left absolutely zero room for any viable legal appeal. The trap I had meticulously built and silently sprung was utterly flawless. The heavy wooden gavel was about to fall, and the crushing weight of the American judicial system was prepared to grind his entire future into fine, miserable dust. There would be no miraculous escape today. The federal trial proceeded with the ruthless efficiency of a highly calibrated industrial machine. There was no dramatic courtroom posturing or drawn-out legal battles to entertain the media. The sheer volume of pristine, irrefutable evidence completely suffocated any pathetic defense strategy Terrence and his overworked public defender attempted to mount. The federal prosecutors methodically dismantled his entire life in front of the silent, attentive jury. They played the crystal-clear audio recordings from Thanksgiving night where he casually agreed to lock me in a state medical facility just to secure his suburban lifestyle. They projected the heavily forged second mortgage documents onto a massive screen, highlighting his sloppy digital signature directly next to my verified handwriting. The financial statements showing the $200,000 he explicitly embezzled from my logistics subsidiary were distributed to every single juror who stared at him with absolute, unadulterated disgust. But the absolute final nail in his proverbial coffin was the devastating testimony of Dr. Richard Vance. The arrogant neurologist, desperate to secure his own immunity deal and avoid federal prison for medical extortion, took the stand and completely sang like a canary. He detailed exactly how Courtney and Terrence had eagerly handed him a thick envelope stuffed with stolen cash to fabricate a highly damaging diagnosis of severe cognitive decline. He confirmed their explicit, malicious intent to strip me of my legal autonomy to seize my historic brownstone. Terrence sat at the defense table, staring blankly at the polished wood, completely crushed by the overwhelming avalanche of his own heavily documented crimes. The jury did not even need to deliberate for a full day. They returned to the courtroom in less than 3 hours. Their verdict was absolutely unanimous on every single count of aggravated wire fraud, identity theft, and massive corporate embezzlement. Terrence was officially and permanently branded a federal felon facing total ruin. The presiding federal judge, a stern woman with absolutely zero tolerance for entitled white-collar criminals, did not hesitate when delivering the final crushing blow. She looked down at Terrence with undisguised contempt and delivered a scathing public rebuke of his profound greed and his absolute moral bankruptcy. She sentenced my son to a mandatory 5 years in a medium-security federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole or sentence reduction. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a resounding crack, echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings of the courtroom, sealing his miserable fate. But the brutal justice did not end with his prison sentence. Jonathan Reed had successfully ensured that the devastating collateral damage extended permanently to his equally guilty co-conspirators. While Courtney and Richard managed to narrowly avoid direct federal prison time by aggressively turning on each other, their professional and financial lives were officially terminated. Jonathan utilized the massive legal influence of Apex Holdings to ensure the federal fraud convictions, and the extensive documentation of their financial crimes were permanently embedded in every major institutional banking database. Courtney and Richard were placed on a highly restrictive national financial blacklist. They were completely banned from ever securing another line of credit, acquiring a commercial loan, opening a standard checking account, or holding any executive position within the real estate or financial sectors for the rest of their natural lives. They were permanently financially excommunicated from the American banking system. Richard would never build another commercial structure or manage a single construction crew. Courtney would never again qualify for so much as a basic department store credit card to buy a cheap handbag. She would be forced to pay for her basic necessities using small wrinkled bills, counting every single penny under the harsh fluorescent lights of discount supermarkets. They were permanently locked out of the wealthy suburban playground they had sacrificed their basic humanity to inhabit. They were condemned to live the rest of their pathetic lives as absolute financial ghosts, operating strictly on whatever meager cash they could scrape together. I walked out of the heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse and stepped onto the wide granite stairs. The bitter New York winter had finally broken, giving way to a surprisingly bright and crisp afternoon sun. The golden light washed over my face, warming my skin against the lingering chill of the wind. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking out over the busy city streets, and took a deep, cleansing breath. There was no triumphant surge of cinematic joy coursing through my veins. I did not feel the sudden euphoric rush of a victorious conqueror who had just vanquished his mortal enemies. I simply felt the profound, quiet peace of a man who had successfully excised a massive malignant tumor from his own body. The constant heavy knot of anxiety that had lived in my stomach since that infamous Thanksgiving dinner was entirely gone. For 45 years I had carried the suffocating weight of an ungrateful son. I had constantly bent over backward, compromised my own boundaries, and endured relentless, subtle disrespect to maintain the fragile illusion of a happy, unified family. I had allowed the toxic poison of his entitlement to slowly infect my daily existence because I falsely believed that biological blood dictated absolute loyalty. Watching the federal marshals lead him away in heavy steel handcuffs did not make me smile, but it allowed me to finally breathe freely for the first time in decades. The cancerous loyalty that tied me to a family of greedy, manipulative parasites had been surgically and permanently removed. Camille and I had survived immense poverty and vicious discrimination to build a legacy of unyielding integrity and hard work. Terrence had aggressively chosen to reject that legacy in favor of cheap artificial validation and stolen luxury. I had simply finalized the paperwork of his deliberately chosen destiny. I was officially free from the burdensome ghost of the son I had lost to profound greed long before he ever forged my signature. I walked down the courthouse steps and slid into the quiet leather interior of my waiting private car. The driver navigated smoothly through the heavy afternoon traffic, taking me back to my historic Brooklyn neighborhood. When the car pulled to a stop, I stepped out onto the familiar sidewalk and turned to look at the massive brick facade of my historic brownstone. The tall, pristine windows reflected the bright afternoon sun, and the heavy oak door stood as a silent testament to the decades of life I had lived within those thick walls. This house had been my absolute sanctuary, my personal fortress, and ultimately the shiny golden bait that successfully exposed the hideous monsters hiding within my own family tree. But as I stared at the immaculate masonry, I realized that this beautiful structure belonged entirely to a past life. It belonged to the silent, hard-working carpenter who readily absorbed insults to keep the fragile peace. It belonged to the devoted husband mourning his late wife in quiet solitude. It belonged to the exhausted father desperately trying to appease an ungrateful, hostile son. I was no longer that man. I was Harrison Hayes, the undisputed chairman of a global financial empire. I would fully embrace the immense power I had accumulated and use it strictly on my own terms. The heavy working-class disguise had served its strategic purpose flawlessly, but it was no longer required. It was officially time to completely close the door on this painful chapter of my existence. I pulled my encrypted satellite phone from my tailored suit jacket and dialed Jonathan Reed. I instructed my ruthless attorney to immediately list the historic brownstone for sale and aggressively transfer the massive proceeds into a newly formed charitable trust. It was time to leave the quiet shadows of Brooklyn completely behind and build a completely new legacy under the bright, unapologetic lights of Manhattan. I did not simply list the property on the open market for greedy commercial developers to fight over. I directly contacted a highly respected heritage conservation trust, ensuring the historic architectural integrity of the Brooklyn brownstone would be preserved indefinitely. They aggressively acquired the building, transforming the very walls where my son maliciously plotted his treacherous extortion into a legally protected community landmark. I packed only the essential items that carried genuine sentimental value, leaving the heavy antique furniture and the lingering toxic ghosts of my past completely behind. Within a single week, I officially relocated to a massive, sprawling penthouse situated directly at the very top of a towering Manhattan skyscraper. The private elevator opened into a breathtaking space constructed entirely of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a completely unobstructed panoramic view of the financial empire I had quietly built. The bright morning sunlight aggressively flooded every single corner of the expansive residence, completely eradicating any lingering shadows. I permanently discarded the faded flannel shirts, the heavily scuffed work boots, and the heavy canvas jackets. I filled my massive new walk-in closets with bespoke Italian suits, tailored silk shirts, and pristine leather Oxfords. I was finally and unapologetically living out in the open. The exhausted working-class carpenter was permanently retired. The anonymous phantom billionaire was officially dead. I was now operating exclusively as the highly visible, unforgiving chairman of Apex Holdings. I walked across the smooth marble floors of my new penthouse, looking down at the bustling city streets far below my feet. I had successfully shed the suffocating heavy armor of my humble disguise, and I felt an incredible surge of raw, unadulterated freedom. But my profound transformation was not merely about aggressively upgrading my personal living standards or simply enjoying the immense wealth I had accumulated over 4 decades. The brutal, agonizing experience with my own biological son had aggressively opened my eyes to a silent, devastating epidemic severely plaguing this country. If a ruthless corporate titan like myself could be actively targeted for severe financial exploitation and terrifying medical extortion by greedy family members, I knew exactly how vulnerable the average retired citizen truly was. I summoned Jonathan Reed to my sunlit penthouse and officially directed him to draft the founding charters for a massive, unprecedented philanthropic initiative. I personally endowed the new organization with an initial operating cash budget of exactly $50 million. I named it the Camille Hayes Justice Foundation. This was not a standard passive charity handing out warm blankets or organizing quiet community bingo nights. It was a highly aggressive, elite legal strike force. I actively employed dozens of the most ruthless corporate attorneys, forensic accountants, and elite private investigators in the country. Their sole explicit mandate was to provide absolutely free, top-tier legal representation to vulnerable elderly individuals who were being actively defrauded, manipulated, or emotionally abused by their own entitled children. When a greedy daughter-in-law attempted to secretly forge a signature on a residential property deed, my foundation would instantly deploy a massive legal team to completely crush her in federal court. When an arrogant son attempted to force his perfectly healthy father into a state medical facility simply to steal his retirement pension, my elite investigators would completely dismantle his life and ensure he faced severe criminal prosecution. I aggressively weaponized my massive wealth to actively hunt down and completely destroy the very same type of cowardly parasites that Terrence and Courtney had willingly chosen to become. We systematically returned stolen homes, reversed heavily fraudulent mortgages, and locked abusive family members in concrete cells. I completely transformed my profound personal betrayal into an absolute legal nightmare for any entitled relative attempting to prey on the elderly generation. In the very center of my expansive glass penthouse overlooking the vast geometric grid of the Manhattan skyline, I hung a massive custom-painted portrait of Camille. I commissioned an elite artist to capture her exact likeness from a photograph taken during the early demanding days of our marriage. She looked incredibly radiant, possessing that fierce, unrelenting determination that originally built the core foundation of our massive empire. I stood quietly in front of the magnificent painting, holding a crystal glass of aged bourbon, allowing the profound silence of my new sanctuary to wash over me. I finally understood the incredible depth of her maternal wisdom. When she lay in her hospital bed during her final fleeting days, she did not ask me to blindly spoil our son or shower him with unearned financial gifts. She grabbed my calloused hands and demanded that I hold him to the absolute highest standard of personal integrity. I had foolishly conflated unconditional parental love with a highly toxic lack of discipline. I thought protecting him from the harsh, grueling realities of the world was my ultimate duty as a provider. I was profoundly wrong. True absolute love is not about blindly enabling wicked behavior or silently absorbing toxic disrespect to maintain a fragile artificial peace. True love requires the sheer immense strength to enforce absolute boundaries and the unyielding discipline to punish profound corruption, even when it completely breaks your own heart to strike the blow. I looked into Camille and her painted eyes and knew with absolute certainty that I had finally fulfilled my sacred promise to her. I had not allowed the dark, suffocating rot of greed to permanently claim our family legacy. I had aggressively burned the infected branches of our family tree entirely to the ground to protect the healthy, enduring roots. The immense pain of losing my only son to his own staggering arrogance had eventually morphed into a profound, clarifying peace. I had successfully defended the honor of the woman I loved, and I had permanently secured the righteous integrity of the massive empire we built together. The modern world operates under a highly dangerous and completely foolish misconception regarding the aging population. The younger generation aggressively assumes that gray hair, fading physical strength, and a quiet, humble demeanor are explicit indicators of extreme vulnerability and profound ignorance. They look at the elderly and see outdated relics who can be easily bullied, aggressively marginalized, and quietly discarded into sterile concrete facilities when they become slightly inconvenient. They falsely believe that their youth and their superficial understanding of modern technology grants them an absolute supreme authority over the very people who physically built the infrastructure they currently stand upon. Terrence Courtney and Richard Montgomery all made this exact fatal miscalculation. They allowed their blinding, unearned arrogance to completely overshadow their basic survival instincts. They aggressively mistook my profound, enduring silence for pathetic weakness. They deeply assumed that a man wearing a faded flannel shirt and heavily scuffed boots could never possibly possess the raw, unadulterated power to completely eradicate their entire existence. I am sharing this highly specific story not to gloat about my massive wealth or to celebrate the absolute destruction of my biological son. I am explicitly sharing this detailed account as a profound, heavy warning to every single entitled individual who believes they can casually step on the backs of the generation that came before them. Respect is not a highly outdated concept reserved for history books. It is the fundamental, absolute currency of basic human survival. If you choose to mistreat the elderly, if you actively scheme to steal their hard-earned resources and strip away their fundamental dignity, You are playing an incredibly dangerous and lethal game of financial roulette. You never truly know exactly who you are aggressively pushing into a corner. Take a very close, terrifying look at the people you easily dismiss as burdensome liabilities. Treat them with the absolute respect they deserve, because you must never, under any circumstances, awaken the ruthless sleeping monster resting quietly beneath the humble guise of a troublesome old man. The absolute greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that unchecked greed is a blinding poison. It completely destroys the human moral compass and convinces arrogant people that quiet kindness is merely a weakness meant to be ruthlessly exploited. Family should be a safe sanctuary built on mutual respect and unwavering loyalty, not a financial resource to be selfishly harvested. You must never mistake a quiet demeanor for ignorance or advancing age for defenselessness. The individuals who quietly observe everything around them often hold the most devastating power. True wealth is never found in designer labels or suburban mansions, but in the unbreakable integrity of your personal character. If you found value in my story, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments below how you would have handled such a profound family betrayal.